there's studies showing that like you can take, a dozen healthy young men, you can put them on a very caloric dense. So they're consuming between 1,200 to 1,500 calories more a day, primarily of processed foods. So this is like refined carbohydrates. This is like high saturated fat. This is like the combo of the saturated fat, sugar, like processed foods. They will gain visceral fat, and particularly fat around the liver, but they don't actually gain weight. When you take these healthy young men and you're giving them these processed foods, you cause the brain to become insulin resistant in 5 days. Yeah. 5 days.
So nuts.
It's nuts.
Dr. Rhonda Patrick, I want to talk visceral fat and really just get into the weeds with it. But I want to open with a question that a lot of people wonder. If you don't have access to a DEXA scan to go get an actual image of how much visceral fat you have, how do people know that they have it?
So there's I would say the number one way that even most physicians will measure visceral fat is by measuring your waistline, your waist circumference. And that's something that people can do at home. So typically women that have a waist circumference of 35 inches or more, that's a sign that they have a high amount of visceral fat, higher than they should. For men, it would be 40 inches or above for their waistline. But it's also important to realize that the visceral fat is the kind of fat that it's known as belly fat. It's the midsection fat. It's this fat that's deep inside your body that's lining your organs. It's lining your liver, your intestines, your pancreas. And it's not the kind of fat that you can just like pinch. Let me find fat that you can't pinch it and feel it. Like this is subcutaneous fat. This is a different type of fat. And so people with visceral fat typically have that apple-shaped body, right, where the fat is in the midsection. So their body kind of looks a little bit more apple-shaped versus perhaps a pear-shaped body where people are storing their fat more in maybe their hips and their thighs. That's not the visceral fat, right? It's the visceral fat is here in that midsection. So that would be, I would say, the easiest way for someone to know if they have visceral fat. Again, definitely if you've got like the gut, right, the belly, I mean, that's a big sign. But measuring your waist circumference is probably the best thing that you could do aside from going and getting a DEXA scan.
Can people be relatively lean appearing and still have, because 40 inches might be hard to achieve if you're leaner, but if someone's lean, you could probably get to 36, 38 and still be having high amounts of visceral or moderate amounts of visceral fat. So do you see that people can actually have that?
Absolutely. Now, this isn't something that I personally see, but I've seen it in the literature and I have been participated in clinical trials. And these individuals, what we refer to them as, is lean but metabolically unhealthy. So they are individuals that actually you look at them and you would think that they do not have a lot of fat or visceral fat, and yet they actually do have visceral fat. And it may not be a ton of it, but it's enough to be metabolically unhealthy. So that is a great question. It's not necessarily, and we can get into the causes of visceral fat and that'll help people also identify, but it's not that you're necessarily going to have a huge waistline. I think that's the biggest indicator of it. But you can be lean and have visceral fat and not really know it. And that's a problem, right? Because then you're basically didn't have all these negative effects of visceral fat, things that we'll talk about. But you won't even really know that you have it. So you're not going to really have any motivation to improve your lifestyle, to try to decrease visceral fat if you don't even know you have it in the first place, right?
Totally. So visceral fat is by nature very inflammatory. So what do people feel if they have that? And that's why it can be kind of sneaky, because it's like you could be, oh, maybe I'm just fatigued, or like what do people feel since it's so metabolically active?
I put a link down below for some other minerals that are important just for everyday life, like sodium, potassium, and magnesium. And you can find those in LMNT. So that is a link for a free sampled variety pack of LMNT electrolytes with any purchase. So you can get their chocolate salt flavor, you can get their lemon lime, you can get their regular lemonade flavor. All this stuff's amazing. And they have ready to drink sparkling cans as well. So this stuff is epic. And it's getting you pretty much a 0 calorie or 5 calorie way to get your minerals in, curb your appetite, and just have something that tastes good. So that link is down below. This stuff has been such a game changer for me for the years. Like when it comes down to just being able to like go through the day without feeling like I need to munch on stuff all the time. Plus my brain feels sharper because salt is so critical for that neurological function, for those neuronal signaling. So that link is down below.
Yeah. So let's talk about the difference between visceral fat and just regular subcutaneous fat. As you mentioned, visceral fat is metabolically active. It is a type of fat that is constantly breaking down triglycerides into free fatty acids. And these, because of the nature of where visceral fat is, it's in the midsection, it's sort of deep in there, it's surrounding the liver, surrounding organs, it's really close to something called the portal vein, which is delivering circulation to other organs, right, including the liver. And so what happens is visceral fat can essentially, it's breaking down these fatty acids, and these fatty acids are then going straight back to the liver. And the problem is that they're also antagonizing insulin receptors. And so it's a big problem because the visceral fat doesn't respond to insulin like subcutaneous fat does. So subcutaneous fat also can break down and form free fatty acids. But once you have a meal, when you eat a meal and insulin is released, the subcutaneous fat, it's a stop signal. Okay, stop breaking down fatty acids. We're going to now deal with this new energy coming in. The visceral fat doesn't do that. It just continues to break down the fatty acids. And so what happens is that new energy coming in, these fatty acids are antagonizing the insulin receptors on the liver, on the muscle. And so the new energy, the glucose that's coming in, stays in your circulation. It's not going into the liver. It's not getting taken up into the muscle. And so what happens is this acute, state of insulin resistance, so to speak. And so your body then tries to overcompensate. Hey, we got to get this glucose, taken up into our liver, into our muscles, right? Let's release more insulin. So then your body releases more insulin to overcompensate. And what happens is that your blood glucose then takes a sharp drop because you just released a ton of insulin, right? And so you get this energy crash because your blood glucose level really dips low after that overcompensation of insulin. And so what happens is people that have a lot of visceral fat will experience, like they'll eat their food and then they'll experience this crash afterwards. And then when you get that crash, that's a signal to the brain, I need energy, right? My blood glucose level is too low. I need energy. And so your brain is then telling your body, hey, you need to eat. And it's prioritizing this energy dense, quick energy foods, right? Processed foods, refined sugars, things like that. And so then you get these cravings for those foods. And it's like this vicious cycle. And you mentioned fatigue, and that's really kind of in this mix as well, because the visceral fat, we talked all about how it causes acute insulin resistance. And we can definitely get into the actual insulin resistance, like, not just like acute after a meal, but it actually causing insulin resistance in a minute. But I want to talk about fatigue because you mentioned it. And it's really important because this visceral fat is also producing inflammatory cytokines. It's producing inflammatory molecules. And so it's activating your immune system at like this low level. So if you think about like anytime you're sick, if you're fighting off a pathogen, whether it's a virus or a bacterial infection, like what's the first thing that you notice? Well, you're fatigued, you're tired, you have no energy. Why is that? One of the reasons is because it takes an enormous amount of energy to activate your immune system. And so your body has this way of triaging energy to your immune system when it needs to be active, right? Because you want to fight off this, viral virus or bacterial, infection, right? That's something that evolution wants us to do, right? Survive. So it requires a lot of energy and takes that energy away from everything else, like your brain, right? So you're basically taking energy away from everything else to prioritize the activation of the immune system. And that's why low level chronic inflammation is a drain on your energy system because it takes all that energy away from everything else. And so that is, these are some of the, I would say, like the acute problems of visceral fat. This is something that people that have more visceral fat would probably notice on a day-to-day basis versus some of the longer term problems we can talk about, like cancer, right? You can't really feel cancer, but you can feel fatigued, you can feel an energy dip, and you can feel cravings, right? So these are, I would say, some of the common problems of visceral fat. And it's a cycle too, because the visceral fat itself is, causing the inflammation, and it's like causing this acute insulin resistance and making you where you're basically going to overcompensate, make more insulin, have the energy crash. But then you're going to like refeed with the very kinds of foods that are increasing visceral fat, and you're going to overfeed, right? Like you're going to consume more calories. And so it's this vicious cycle of, terrible eating, energy crashes, not feeling good, and then like, gaining more visceral fat.
Is there an argument to be had that visceral fat is almost a precursor to insulin resistance, or is it a two-way street? Because I know that insulin resistance can definitely, seemingly, if you look at the literature, seems like it contributes to visceral fat. But hearing you say this, it's almost like, which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah, it definitely is a cycle for sure. The visceral fat causes insulin resistance. Like we do know that because of the free fatty acids that I was mentioning. The visceral fat is making these free fatty acids, constantly breaking down triglycerides with no stop signal. It's not responding to insulin. And so your fatty acids that are being made, they do, and there's all kinds of, like, you can get into all the molecular mechanisms without talking about all those pathways. It's a pretty much a scientific fact that free fatty acids do basically cause insulin resistance. They are antagonizing those insulin receptors. And so your organs are not responding to insulin like they should. So it's definitely a cause of insulin resistance, and then it's a vicious cycle as well. So I would say both for sure, if that answers your question. But, the insulin resistance is the beginning of type 2 diabetes, right? So what we're talking about with insulin resistance is that your body's not responding to a normal amount of insulin. And so your pancreas kind of dumps out, like I said, it overcompensates and dumps out more insulin to try to force the body to respond, right? Force your liver and your muscles and your tissues to respond to the insulin, take the glucose up. Because you don't want glucose sitting around in your bloodstream, in your vascular system. It's very reactive. It reacts with proteins through the Maillard reaction, and it forms something called advanced glycation end products. And these things are damaging everything. They're damaging the collagen that lines your blood vessels, causing hypertension. They're damaging the collagen that lines your heart, the myocardium and the pericardium. It stiffens it. And it's like the major cause of the stiffening of the heart with age. And this is a huge increase for cardiovascular disease. And so your body wants to take the glucose up into your tissues. That's important, right, for health. And so the problem is that eventually the pancreas can't keep up. It can't keep overcompensating. At some point, this system, you run out of gas, right? You just can't keep up. And that's when you kind of tip into that type 2 diabetes, realm where it's like, okay, I'm no longer just insulin resistant. At some point, it's like now my pancreas can't even overcompensate. It's just like there's not enough in there to do it. So the type 2 diabetes is that's when you really have reached a problem, right? Where you've really the visceral fat and the whole inflammatory cycle has gotten to that point where it's gotten really, really bad. And then there's the problem with the fatty liver, right? So you're constantly releasing these fatty acids, and as I mentioned, the portal vein, it's going right to the liver. And the visceral fat it's all in this same area. And so what happens is typically, when you're giving fatty acids to the liver, it prioritizes those fats, right? So the new energy coming in, the new glucose, whatever coming in, it's not going to be prioritizing that. It's got these fatty acids. But what happens with the visceral fat is it's just constantly churning it out. And so the liver's like, what do you do with it? There's too much fat.
Especially when it's in tandem with another meal, then you have this huge surplus, right?
Exactly. And so it starts to accumulate it around the liver. And that is what we probably all have heard of. This is the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And this is also a really big problem because, over time, what happens is the liver starts to get inflamed as it accumulates that fat, and it starts to get, fibrosis. And so it's just like this vicious cycle of, when you have an inflamed liver and a fibrotic liver, you're going to become even more insulin resistant. You're going to become even more less responsive to the glucose and the insulin, right? And so it's just this terrible, terrible cycle, and really all coming down to stemming from this visceral fat. Visceral fat is really at the core of it. And it is a cycle, as you mentioned, right? It's not a one-way street. It's definitely a two-way street. They're feeding back to each other.
Do we find that visceral fat is really just a proxy for liver fat, or vice versa? Or I guess what I'm asking is, can you have high amounts of visceral fat and not extraordinarily fatty liver, right? Like, can you have this fat that starts to deposit without really being fatty liver? Or is there like a kind of a quintessential sort of like, no, it's usually this ratio, like it starts in the liver, kind of spreads outward? Because I know we even have like myocardial fat, right? We have these things that can like kind of spread everywhere. Is there any link there, or is it all pretty much epicenter at the liver?
I do think liver is the epicenter for sure. But yeah, it does start to spread around other organs through that portal vein, right? I mean, the portal vein is delivering these fatty acids to other organs as well. The intestines, the pancreas, but the liver is really the epicenter of it, where that's like the start of it. And there's studies showing that like you can take a healthy, a dozen healthy young men. I mean, these are people that are young. They don't have visceral fat, much visceral fat. They're not overweight. And you can put them on this was a recent publication in Nature. You can put them on a very caloric dense. So they're consuming between 1,200 to 1,500 calories more a day, primarily of processed foods. So this is like refined carbohydrates. This is like high saturated fat. This is like the combo of the saturated fat, sugar, like processed foods. After 5 days of eating this calorically dense, very, very energetic, dense food, they will gain visceral fat, and particularly fat around the liver. So their livers start to get fatty, but they don't actually gain weight.
Interesting.
So like they gain like a pound of weight. So you wouldn't really know that you're gaining that visceral fat, but, unless you're doing, a DEXA scan or something like that.
That's
and even at that point, the waist circumference won't work because they didn't really gain weight, but they did gain the visceral fat. And so it just shows you that visceral fat is very responsive to dietary changes, particularly if you're talking about excess calories, and particularly if we're talking about excess calories in the form of refined, high fatty foods, so processed foods.
So is this a situation where calories matter, but we start to actually pay attention to macronutrient composition or combinations of nutrients? Because it's like, yes, calories matter, but maybe there's a situation where, hey, this is actually the composition of the food that you eat in also with some kind of caloric surplus really makes a difference here.
Yes, absolutely. The combination of the refined sugars, so like sugar sweetened beverage, these like really, really like high glycemic foods without a fiber matrix. I mean, it's hitting, the glucose is hitting the bloodstream so quick, and it's causing a pretty massive insulin spike as well. And the thing about this is that, and this kind of like segues into brain insulin resistance. Have you heard of this?
Yes. Yeah.
And people usually think about insulin resistance with respect to the liver, or they'll think about it with muscles. They're not thinking about the brain. Well, the brain can become insulin resistant, and that is terrible. So typically, like the brain responds to insulin for a variety of reasons. Okay. And I'm going to answer your question, but it basically, when there's an insulin response, when insulin gets to the brain, it's a signal to the brain to, for one, stop eating. It's a satiety signal, right? It's like, okay, I'm full, right? And the other thing it does is that it is basically directing the rest of the body how to store the energy they just consumed, right? So are we going to store it as subcutaneous fat, this kind of fat that we can pinch, or are we going to store it as this midsection fat, this like deeper belly fat, the visceral fat? And the brain plays a really important role in basically being the conductor, telling the body how to store that fat. So when the brain becomes insulin resistant, those signals go away, particularly in the hypothalamus part of the brain. You're no longer satiated after a meal, and even after a high energy meal, you'll just keep overeating. You'll keep eating more. And the body doesn't know how to store the fat, or store the energy, or use it. And so what happens is you end up storing more visceral fat. And this is known that people that are more insulin resistant in their brain, they tend to have more visceral fat. Well, it turns out that high sugary foods, obviously calorie, dense as well, cause this insulin resistance in the brain. And this is also a new study. Actually, this is the study I was talking about, is that they became insulin resistant in their brain. These were the healthy young men that ate the 1,200 to 1,500 calories a day, and it was refined foods. Their brain became insulin resistant, and they accumulated, fat around the liver, but they really didn't gain much weight, like 1 pound. So you can actually cause your brain to become insulin resistant pretty acutely, and it does come down to those like really high energy, like high caloric, high sugar foods that do that. You're not going to really see that if you're eating a plate of vegetables, versus like a bunch of cookies and cake and like high fat, high sugary foods.
Yeah. And if the conductor is sending a distorted signal, then it really doesn't matter how many calories you're eating. It matters where it's going.
Yeah, where it's going. And we know it's going to that midsection, which is so bad. So I think it becomes this vicious cycle too, because then you basically don't have that satiety signal. And so people tend to start overeating more.
What are they going to overeat? They're going to overeat, refined carbs and
Right, exactly. Because again, it all comes down to that. Again, you have these energy crashes and then you get the cravings, right? And you're craving the foods that are more going to give you the quick energy because that's what your body thinks it needs. It's like, I'm having a crisis right now, right? My blood glucose has gone too low. I'm crashing. I'm having a crisis. I need to replenish immediately. And so you crave those quick energy foods, processed foods.
When it starts having that crisis, does that sort of tie into like the glucocorticoid receptors and the response with sort of stress in visceral fat? Like, does your body just sense you in this almost high stress situation? Is that going to influence more storage into the visceral region?
I'm sure it does. I mean, stress itself, cortisol, does cause the body to store more fat viscerally as well. So basically, like if you're in a chronically stressed state, your body will tend to store more visceral fat. And I don't know exactly why that is. I mean, there's some evolutionary hypotheses as to why visceral fat exists in the first place. And it's kind of, I mean, again, this is hard to prove, right? Yeah. But it makes sense. It's thought that the reason that we store visceral fat, it's a stress response because your body's trying to protect you from like a puncture wound or something, like some terrible animal is going to come bite you or something, and it's protecting your organs. It's like a fat lining your organs, so it's protecting you, and it's some kind of protective response, which probably ties into why when you're really stressed and your cortisol goes high, it's like, oh, it's that time. We gotta store the fat around the organ.
Stressed and weak and vulnerable and prone to attack.
We need to protect ourselves. Yeah. We need to protect our internal organs. And this is super interesting. And I don't, like I said, it's a hypothesis, but it kind of makes sense.
No, it does.
About it.
There's some other stuff. They also talk a little bit about it potentially protecting against lipopolysaccharides, right? Like potentially from, inflammatory or pathogenic material coming out of the gut, right? I don't know if that's, again, that's hard to prove too. That's another discussion that people have on it, which it seems maybe to a small degree that would make sense, but personally have a hard time imagining that like visceral fat would like diffuse a major inflammatory storm that's coming out of the gut, but it's plausible.
I know lipopolysaccharides do bind to LDL particles through they're basically binding to like the ApoB part of it, and that's partly thought to negate some of that inflammatory response, which
makes sense.
It makes sense, and that's why when you have inflammation, your LDL goes up really high.
Oh, I didn't even know that makes sense.
Yeah, your body starts to increase more VLDL, and then LDL goes up. Lipopolysaccharides binds to the LDL. Unfortunately, because it's attracted to that ApoB protein on LDL is how your body recycles LDL through the liver, and it obscures the ApoB, and so you end up not being able to recycle the LDL as well, which is why the combination of inflammation and like high saturated fat.
I was going to say, because that's that whole cycle of you have to recycle the saturated fat and all. Interesting. That opens up because that's a whole separate discussion, but it's sometimes it's hard to have these discussions with the almost like two dogmatic diet tribes where you still have to say, even to the carb insulin model people, that like, hey, like high saturated fat is still problematic, like independent of itself. I mean, even like the new food pyramid still is actually addressing the fact that like high amounts of saturated fat are probably not the best thing. That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. The storm is the saturated fat plus the sugar, because the sugar is causing that inflammation.
Yeah.
And then you've got the saturated fat increasing your lipoproteins, your LDL. And so it's essentially like the perfect storm.
Yeah, totally.
And that's the problem as well. But since we're talking about the inflammation and the visceral fat, I mean, imagine it. So if you have the visceral fat, you're getting this constant inflammatory signal as well. So again, then you're taking more saturated fat.
Yeah.
You've got the inflammation that's being generated. It's not good. What's also interesting is this inflammation, it's not only having this acute effect on like your energy levels, right? Yes, it's an energy sink because it's activating the immune system. It's also linked to cancer. And this has been shown. So people that have high amounts of visceral fat are 44% more likely to have a variety of different types of cancer, like the main ones, colon cancer, pancreatic cancer, liver cancer. It goes on and on. And that is because, and even when waist circumference is considered, so even after correcting for waist circumference, the visceral fat itself increases cancer incidence. And, that's obviously the human studies that have linked that, but there have been animal studies that have mechanistically looked at that now and said, okay, well, what happens when we have an animal with visceral fat? Well, it turns out that the inflammatory molecules, and they're making quite a bit of them, they're actually transforming normal cells into cancer cells. They're actually causing normal cells to become cancerous. They're damaging the cells. So that is, over time, when you get enough damage, eventually you're going to get it in a part of the cell that's going to lead to an oncogenic mutation. So yeah, it's bad. Cancer incidence, and then, obviously just all-cause mortality is higher. So people with visceral fat, there's a variety of studies that have looked at this, and usually the studies are measuring waist circumference, which again is a proxy for visceral fat. Not always, because you can have visceral fat, as you mentioned, and not have a large waist circumference. But generally, if you do have a large waist circumference, then we're talking high levels of visceral fat, right? Those individuals they're at any given point, they're twice as likely to die from like an early cause of death than people without like a high waist circumference or visceral fat, right? So, visceral fat, it's linked to all kinds of problems, problems in the way we feel on a day-to-day basis, but also like long-term disease risk, So it's something really important to focus on. I mean, I think it's something that people really need to be aware of, like how bad it is. It's not just a cosmetic thing, concerned with looking good and not having, and people are with subcutaneous fat. That's what they're kind of focused on. It's that belly fat. It's that visceral fat that's deep and not even necessarily showing as belly fat in some people, right?
For sure.
That's the problem. So it's good to have these conversations and to educate people about that, because, you know, it's not something that people really know about.
No. And the good news is, I mean, I know we can talk about this, is that yes, it stores fast, but from the literature I've seen, it also goes away fast when you do the right things. You know, I think sometimes like you're looking at the actual like cubic volume of visceral fat, and granted, you absolutely can have a large volume of it, but as a means in terms of volume compared to the overall adiposity we carry throughout our body, there's not a whole lot of it compared to that, right? So it's easier to lose it, right? With the right sort of lifestyle intervention. So I definitely want to get into that now. Like, what are some ways that we can start kicking this stuff down?
Yes. Visceral fat, the good news is that you can lose it, you can reduce it, you can reverse insulin resistance in the brain, you can reverse insulin resistance in the body, you can reverse fatty liver, right? So that's the good news. How do you do that? The number one way is exercise. Exercise will help you lose visceral fat. What type of exercise? That would be cardiovascular exercise in the moderate to vigorous intensity range, high intensity interval training at the top. I mean, there are tons of studies out there looking at people that do dietary changes or exercise, comparing the two, and you can make a dietary change. In other words, like, you can start to eat a little bit healthier, but that's not necessarily going to make you lose visceral fat, particularly if you're not reducing your calorie intake, if you're still kind of consuming the same amount of calories. Exercise is the one that's going to do that. I mean, even people that don't lose weight can lose visceral fat. Like, there's studies out there, multiple studies showing that. Like, if you're engaging in routine aerobic exercise, we're talking jogging, running, swimming, cycling, and then as I mentioned, high intensity interval training, we can dive more into that. But those people will lose visceral fat even without losing weight, right? And you lose the most amount of visceral fat early on any sort of exercise program or even weight loss program, something that would be a calorie restricting type of program. And that will be next on my list on how to lose visceral fat. But there have been a variety of studies looking at the types of exercise and what's best and what's the frequency and what's the dose, right? Like, what are all these parameters that you need to consider to really lose the visceral fat? And I think it's pretty clear to me after reading, you know, the exercise literature, looking at, you know, visceral fat loss, that you really need to, if you're doing more of a moderate to vigorous type of continuous exercise, so that would be like the jogging, the running, the cycling, the swimming, probably need to do about 3 hours a week. That's like a good dose. But if you look at the literature and combine sort of like multiple studies, 3 hours a week of that, oftentimes like 3 sessions a week. So in some cases, people will be doing an hour. Now you can break that up. You could do 5 days a week, right? And do like shorter sessions. But it does seem like if you're in that moderate to vigorous exercise zone, like 3 hours a week. And then if you're doing more of the vigorous, high intensity interval training and the vigorous, you can pretty much cut that in half. Yeah. So, an hour and a half. But there are even studies showing that high intensity interval training, so we're talking about the kind of exercise where there's a lot of protocols out there. I mean, you can do, a minute on, a minute off, where you're going as hard as you can for that minute. Obviously, you're not going to be going all out. You can do like Tabata, 20-second on, 10-second off. You can do even circuit training. Circuit training is a type of interval training, right? CrossFit training. Whatever works best for you. High intensity interval training, it's been shown that you can even do 30 minutes or less than 30 minutes 3 times a week and lose visceral fat. And high intensity interval training, when you compare it head on to even moderate, getting into that moderate to vigorous intensity continuous training zone, high intensity interval training wins when with respect to losing visceral fat. The best of both worlds is you do both. Yep. Like, you combine, right? Like, you do some HIIT and you do some of this, like moderate to vigorous, so running, cycling, swimming, whatever's your jam. You got to make it consistent. That's the key, because you have to be consistent about the exercise. If you stop exercising, you won't continue to lose visceral fat. And that's really important, because people that are trying to actively lose it because they have it, you really have to stay on that program. So make it a part of your personal hygiene. Do whatever is like that appeals to you, and make sure you're consistent with it. Resistance training is a big question people have. That's another type of exercise. It's important. You want to gain muscle mass. You want to maintain muscle mass. You have to engage in resistance training to do that. Very important for longevity, right? I mean, you've talked about it,
For sure. Yeah.
I've talked about it on my podcast. It's very, very important for healthy aging. However, when it comes to visceral fat loss, it's a little bit, there's some nuance there. So what I've seen in the literature is that, people that are younger, they're not going to lose visceral fat on a resistance training program alone. And that has been a head-to-head comparison with aerobic training. So people that were doing aerobic exercise versus resistance training, I'm talking younger adults, they only lose the visceral fat if they're on the aerobic exercise program. The resistance training alone didn't lose. And we've all been to the gym and seen the gym rats, great muscles. They're yoked. Yeah. They got the belly fat, man. And it's like, you have to add in that aerobic exercise. Where I've seen positive effects with resistance training and losing visceral fat is with middle-aged adults, particularly postmenopausal women. And that, to me, makes sense, because when we get into the causes, we can talk about some of the causes of visceral fat. We've kind of touched on it, but there is an age-related cause, particularly when it comes to hormones. So women, before they're perimenopausal, before they're postmenopausal, they have a lot of estrogen that they're making throughout their cycle. Estrogen does tell the body to store fat subcutaneously. So women that are, premenopausal will have more subcutaneous fat than visceral fat. As soon as they hit perimenopause and then eventually menopause, where does it start to hit?
Yep.
Belly, right? And any woman that's gone through this knows it. That's the thing, right? Because you no longer have that estrogen signal there telling your body to store the fat subcutaneously rather than viscerally, right? Rather than around your organs in the midsection. And so where this comes in is resistance training. Testosterone actually causes the body to burn visceral fat at a higher rate. Okay. And so men don't have as much of an issue with visceral fat, although as they get older and their testosterone does decline, they do start to more easily gain visceral fat. And this is probably why you'll see the statistics out there. 50% of men over the age of 50 have a high amount of visceral fat. 70% of women over the age of 50 have a high amount of visceral fat. Getting back to the resistance training, I think there's a hormonal component in there as well. And that's why postmenopausal women are more responsive to it, right? Like you are increasing testosterone when you're working out. When you're young and you have a lot of testosterone already, like the amount that you're increasing probably isn't making much of a difference over what you're already making. So
yeah, that makes, and I'm sure androgen receptor density plays a role too. Like what's actually able to bind, right? And actually have a binding site versus just like circulating and converting to DHT and making you bald. And, there's all those the other thing that's kind of interesting is that I feel like resistance training, it might be hard to get like a cohort on this entirely, because I bet you there is a play where resistance training helps as a glucose sink for sort of the downstream effects of visceral fat. I would imagine, if I could guess, you probably hit a little bit more of a ceiling if you have some muscle mass on you with visceral fat. Like it's probably a little bit harder to get to an extreme amount of visceral fat because you at least have a sink for excess glucose to stop that sort of spiral, or at least attenuate it a little bit.
Exactly. And that's where the key is combining them. Like if you're doing some sort of aerobic and or high intensity interval training and resistance training, it's going to amplify it for sure. Like you mentioned, you are making your muscles more responsive to glucose. You are making them more sensitive to insulin with resistance training as well. And so it's going to amplify that as well. So there's definitely a role, I think, for resistance training in a visceral fat loss program. I just think that like really making sure you're hitting some of that more vigorous intensity aerobic exercise, high intensity interval training is really important there. And like you said, it's circuit training too, right? Like you can
incorporate it. Yeah.
Right. Like with CrossFit, right? So that like you're getting that aerobic as well as you're activating your muscles and getting that resistance training as well.
Have you heard, I'll just interrupt you for 1 second. Like of the, because this is, I know we both kind of we enjoy that style of training. There's this, have you heard of the interference theory? Like where they used to think that if you were to combine cardio and resistance training, that they would like impede one another. Like they would actually, and there's some, I can't remember where it was published. It was, I think 2023. It was like completely debunked the interference theory, where essentially if you're trying to get to like total like submaximal lift, it's a different story. But for the most part, intertwining cardio with your actual resistance training doesn't seem to reduce your output that much on your resistance training, not to any measurable degree. So I think sometimes I'm just going to call a spade a spade. I think people like endurance cardio because it's kind of easy. Sometimes, it's just easy to hop on there. Like you can just do it. And I think I can speak for a lot of men. Same with resistance training. Honestly, like if conventional resistance training, if you're training like Dorian Yates or something like that, it's a different story. But if you're, going to the gym and you're a gym bro and you're resistance training, look me in the eyes and tell me that it's really, really hard. Trust me, I've been there. Like that's not the hard part. The hard part is the consistency. But you ask them to do some kind of high intensity interval training, that's hard, right? So being able to like intertwine that with resistance training, it would make sense in your mind. You think, well, this is going to prohibit me from being able to do my maximal lifts, and that might be the case psychologically, but hopefully this clip right here is enough satisfaction for people to say like, no, it actually doesn't impede. Like if you have adequate recovery, if you say, I'm going to go do a sprint session and then I'm going to recover for a couple of minutes and then I'm going to go bench press. Like you should be able to bench press within 10% of your max.
I've talked to Brett Schoenfeld about that, and it's for sure. I think that myth has been debunked. Like you said, you're not maybe if you're like some elite athlete that's trying to like power lift or something, right?
Different story.
But different story.
Yeah.
And for if anything, the aerobic exercise actually helps improve the recovery.
Agreed.
It's bringing all the goodies to the muscle, which is important for recovery, right? Blood flow. So.
Not to mention combining, you said, you're doing the high intensity interval training and then also doing your lower or moderate aerobic work. That allows you, by building that base of, zone 2, zone 3 sometimes, it actually allows you to get more of that post-exercise oxygen consumption fat burning that you get from your HIIT. So you actually help yourself out with your HIIT. It makes your HIIT more effective for fat loss because you're actually able to go into, oxidative phosphorylation and a little bit better after your workout.
So all the reason to combine them.
Yeah.
I mean, there's
Agreed.
there's no reason not to. I would say the second major way to lose visceral fat, that was like the first, and we definitely went on for that. In my opinion, from reading the literature, the next major lever to pull would be calorie intake. And so pretty much any weight loss program will help you lose visceral fat. Like I said, the most amount of visceral fat is actually lost early in a weight loss program. So anything that's going to restrict calories, whether it is counting calories or it's intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating, even pharmacological treatments we have now, like GLP-1 receptor agonists, Ozempic, for example. Anything that's going to reduce your calorie intake will also reduce visceral fat. And in fact, it does, food composition is important. Like you do want to eat healthy during that period of eating, if you're intermittent fasting, for example, because as I mentioned, the brain insulin resistance can happen pretty acutely. And certainly when you start to eat a lot of like high glycemic foods without the fiber matrix that are refined and fatty, that is essentially, blunting the insulin response in the brain. And so you're basically going to start over consuming more, right? But there's this interesting study that was done. It's called the Carb Funk trial, Carb FUNC trial. And this trial was looking at the different types of diets. If you calorically restrict, so they're isocaloric, in other words, all 3 of the diets in this trial had the same amount of calories, and these calories were, restricted. So they're basically like eating fewer calories than they would, right? So it was a calorie deficit that they were in. But the different diets were, the first diet was more of a refined carbohydrate diet, although I would say the refined carbohydrates were like grains, not cake and sugar. So different kind of refined in a way. The second diet was also a higher carb diet, but it was more of whole food type of carbs, like vegetables and fruits. And then the third diet was a low carb, high fat diet. And again, all 3 diets, they were isocaloric. So they were all people eating these different diets were consuming the same amount of calories. The key was they were in a calorie deficit. And guess what? All 3 diets caused loss in visceral fat. There was no big differences that were statistically significant between the 3, which was a bit surprising. You'd think, oh, maybe the higher grain diet would, you wouldn't lose as much visceral fat because it's like more refined, but it was really the calorie deficit that was the most important. And the fact that they were in that calorie deficit was the key to losing visceral fat. So I think that the crux of the story here is that whatever way you like to reduce your calories, for me, I like to do intermittent fasting. And I like to skip one meal. That works for me. So if I skip one of the meals of the day, that is how I reduce my calories. As long as I can make sure I'm eating a good, healthy, balanced, diet when I am eating my meals, then I'm good. Some people like to just like count their calories. Like I know some people like to do that. Whatever works well for you, that's what you should do. And if you can be in that calorie deficit, that's going to help you lose the visceral fat. That's the next, I think, biggest lever that you can pull. Now, when it comes to diet composition, it's not like it doesn't matter, because you will, if you are eating the refined carbohydrates, as I mentioned, 5 days of eating a high carb, high saturated fat. And when I say that, that's essentially processed foods. You go to any processed food package, it's high in fat and it's high in refined sugars. Like that's the selling combo. It tastes good. That is going to cause insulin resistance in your brain after just 5 days. And that's basically going to make you overeat. You're going to overeat because you're not going to have the satiety signal. You're going to start to store visceral fat because your hypothalamus part of your brain isn't responding to insulin, so it's not communicating to your body how to store the fat, right? Or how to store the energy that you're consuming. So it's kind of a what I'm trying to say here is that diet composition does play a big role in the accumulation of visceral fat versus losing it. You do have to be in a calorie deficit. You can't just change the composition of your diet. Now maybe you'll stop gaining more of it, so it stops that cycle of gaining more of it. But like to lose what you already have, you have to be in a deficit, right? Like that makes sense, right?
For sure. Yeah.
I hope I'm explaining this well, because it's a little nuanced, right? Yes, diet composition plays a role in the ability to produce and accumulate visceral fat.
Accelerate a cycle, but
It's a cycle, right? But if you only change diet composition and not your calorie intake, it's going to be hard to lose that visceral fat. You need the exercise. You need to be in that calorie deficit as well. And then there's some other factors that play a role. I would say sleep is up there. Believe it or not, there have been some studies looking at sleep deprivation in the form of restriction and how it affects visceral fat accumulation. So most of the studies are done with college students. They're always like healthy young men. It's like the standard participant that you're going to get, right, is a healthy young man. So healthy young men that were, this was an interesting study. I think it was like published in 2022. It was a small study, not like a huge number of men that were in the study, but it was about 21 days study. And for 2 of those weeks, the two weeks, these men were put on a sleep restricted, schedule. So they were only allowed to sleep for 4 hours a night versus like 9 hours a night. And this was 2 weeks. And after those 2 weeks, these men had gained like 11% visceral fat, and they essentially gained like no weight. Like nothing reflected on the scale, maybe like a pound. Again, It's like the pound, but like I gain a pound in a day. I'm like,
Yeah.
So really no weight gain, but they gain visceral fat. And then when they're put back on a normal sleep schedule, 9 hours, they still were accumulating visceral fat for the short term. It like took a while for the body to like recalibrate. Now, it wasn't that they lost the visceral fat. It was just that they stopped gaining it eventually. So sleep plays a really important role in the accumulation and like your body's ability to actually accumulate visceral fat. So you can imagine it as an amplifier. I like to imagine it as an amplifier along with your diet and your exercise routine, right? So making sure you're getting good quality sleep is important. If you're constantly sleep deprived, I mean, think of people that are shift workers, firefighters, for example. I mean, they're going through these periods where they're absolutely getting no sleep for days, right? And so they're very prone to this visceral fat accumulation. So they have to have the exercise dialed in. They have to have the diet dialed in as well, because they're definitely more susceptible to it. So I say sleep alone, getting good sleep isn't going to make you lose the fat. What I'm getting at is that if you're chronically sleep deprived, you're going to be more prone to gaining visceral fat, and that's an important distinguishing factor here, right?
Do you think it's more to do with if we get into the mechanisms, is it more to do with the stress, or is it the fact that there is because we do know from the literature pretty concretely that you can have even acute insulin resistance that comes as a result of even one night of poor sleep?
Yes. I think it has to do with both. I think the biggest factor here, and this is a great question, Thomas, you can have, acute insulin resistance happen after even one night of like sleeping 4 hours. So that is because your body, there's a variety of factors going on, but you do become less sensitive to insulin from sleep deprivation. You're also going to you're going to overeat. And these studies have been as well. People that are even, again, one night, and then you extend it to 3 nights, and it's exacerbated, right? 3 nights of like getting 4 hours of sleep, 4 hours of sleep a night. It's pretty detrimental because you become acutely insulin resistant, and you start to have these cravings for high energy foods. And so people start to overeat, and they tend to over consume calories as well they normally wouldn't do that. It's the sleep deprivation that's doing it. So it's that cycle where you're acutely becoming insulin resistant, right? And you're consuming more food. So it's kind of starting that cycle of the visceral fat accumulation. And then you have the stress response and the cortisol as well, right? So that's like, it's just this perfect storm of factors. But yeah, great question. And I'm so glad you touched on that. For me, I wore continuous glucose monitors for years, and when I was a young new parent, actually I wasn't that young, but when I was a new parent, I immediately noticed my blood glucose regulation was crazy off. And if I had done an insulin resistant test, I'm sure I would have acutely been insulin resistant, and I had to do high intensity interval training to like negate that. And it really, really almost completely negated it. Almost. I mean, it was insane, because like the first month or so, like for a woman, like you're not really exercising much. Like can't, like you're recovering from like a very traumatic event on your body. So that's when I noticed it the most, when I wasn't exercising. And so sleep is so important for glucose regulation, for insulin sensitivity, and for the accumulation of visceral fat, because that, at the end of the day, plays into it, right? You will start to accumulate fat when you become insulin resistant. Again, coming back to that question of yours, the chicken or the egg, it is a two-way street. They're both doing the same thing. Visceral fat causes insulin resistance. Insulin resistance causes you to accumulate more visceral fat. So it's this vicious cycle you have to break free from. And how do you break free from? Exercise, vigorous intensity, HIIT, getting good sleep, getting in a caloric deficit. You have to do that, if you're really trying to lose it. If you have it, you're trying to lose it. Diet composition. And then again, these other levers like stress, whatever. For me, I like to exercise. That helps me with my cortisol, my stress response. A lot of people we live in a stressful time. You go on social media and it's like that's the algorithm. It's designed to stress you out, right? It's designed to alarm you. So whatever you can do, whether that's meditation, whether it's prayer, whether it's exercise, whatever routine that you can stick to that helps you, going out and walks in nature, exercising in nature, like all of these things can help lower cortisol. And that's another lever to kind of like amplify all these other effects, right, that we're talking about in terms of
Totally.
like, lowering our visceral fat and decreasing our visceral fat. I mean, this is really important for people that do have visceral fat. Like, you have to get rid of it. For those of us that are like, we're already doing these things, we have to keep doing them so that we don't gain it. And especially as we get older, for me, I'm a middle-aged woman. As like, you start to approach middle age, again, it's going to be easier and easier for your body to start to store that visceral fat. So, and that's again because of the hormonal changes that are happening. People also get more sedentary as they get older. There's all sorts of things happening.
You also have, flat out, just more damage-associated molecular patterns as you get older. You have just more age-related inflammation that's just circulating, right, for most people. And I think that's a contributing factor. Because when you look at insulin resistance, you look at brain insulin resistance, you look at any kind of mitochondrial dysfunction or syndrome X or any of that, they're all inflammatory conditions, right? At the end of the day, it's like I always encourage people when they're looking at insulin resistance, I'm like, this is not a problem with eating too many carbohydrates. This is an inflammatory problem, and your response to carbohydrates is just a side effect of it. The carbohydrates may have been part of the cause, but it's at the end of the day, this is a big overarching inflammatory issue. And it sounds like, visceral fat kind of ropes right back into that. It's like we need to get this inflammation under control, which I think it would help if people understand maybe what some of the causes of visceral fat. We can also talk about causes of inflammation too, because I feel like that's something that might be interesting to kind of tie in together.
Yeah. And with respect to the causes of visceral fat, and we've been discussing some of them already, obviously obesity, overweight, like all those things, insulin resistance, like those things do feed into causing more visceral fat. But the diet composition does play a role here, as well as, I would say, the diet composition, it feeds into the excess calorie intake too. Yeah. Because I like to go back to that nature study, when you take these healthy young men and you're giving them these processed foods, which are calorically dense, right? So, they're eating more of a calorically dense but very high fat, high sugar diet. You cause the brain to become insulin resistant in 5 days. Yeah. 5 days.
So nuts.
It's nuts. And what happens is, without even actual weight gain, other than a pound, you're accumulating visceral fat and fat around the liver. This was in healthy young men, right? So I do think diet composition, if we're thinking about causes of visceral fat, we have to take up and think about the brain and the role of the brain in this, because, the brain at the end of the day is really important for satiety signals. And if you are not getting those signals, then you're going to overeat. When you're supposed to be full, you're not going to be full. And your body's then going to store that energy in the wrong place, right? It's going to store it as visceral fat versus the subcutaneous fat. So I think that diet composition is important there. And then you have to also realize that when we're talking about brain insulin resistance, yes, it causes your body to accumulate visceral fat, but it also is associated with inflammation in the brain. It's associated with, insulin is an important signal to the neurons in your brain to grow. It's anabolic, just like in muscle, right? It can be anabolic. And it's also important for neurotransmitter signaling in neurons. And when you take that away in the case of insulin resistance, when the neurons aren't responding to insulin, so it's like the insulin's not there, your neurons, they don't have that purpose, right? They start to atrophy and die.
Yep.
And it plays a role in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease. It plays a role in the accumulation of some of the pathological features of Alzheimer's disease, like amyloid beta plaques. So I know I went on a tangent here, but it all comes down to, because you can acutely cause insulin resistance in the brain in such a short period of time from diet composition and calorie intake, and they're kind of intertwined, because if you're eating refined processed foods, these ultra processed foods, you are going to consume more calories. You are. For one, because they're calorically dense. For two, because it's completely disrupting the satiety signals in your brain. And so you want to eat more. And that study was done by Kevin Hall, right? Where you basically like give people like free access to the food. And if it's processed foods, they will consume 500 more calories on average a day than people that are given whole foods, right? And that's because you're not getting those satiety signals.
Which is crazy. That's a pound of fat a week right there. 500 calories a day.
But like, I think, I don't remember, is that how much weight they gained in that study?
Well, it's like if you were to consistently do that, 500 extra calories per day.
Right. But think about the visceral fat.
Yeah, exactly.
It's more. It's more. Like I just mentioned that study, they were consuming almost 12 to 1,500 calories a day. And they only gained a pound of weight after 5 days. We're talking visceral fat gain is happening before that weight gain. It's happening and you don't know it's happening. And it's not that you can't ever cheat, especially if you exercise, because that's going to help negate everything. The exercise, right? It's going to help make you insulin sensitive. It's going to help you take up the glucose. It helps with the satiety hormone signaling, all that stuff. It's like the cure, the panacea, truly. So it's not like you can't cheat and have some processed foods. It's that you can't eat them every day, and you certainly shouldn't be eating them if you're sedentary. Yeah. If you're sedentary, my goodness, like that's like the worst combination ever. But even people that are like sedentary, but they're like, I don't eat, I try to follow a whole foods. Well, that's great. But, you're still like, if you have some visceral fat there, like that's not going to make you lose it by itself. So, to kind of go back to the question of causes of visceral fat, the diet composition, I do like to mention that because of the brain effects on causing insulin resistance in the brain. And no one's really thinking about that. I don't even hear people talking about it. But that study to me was like an eye-opener, because it's like, wow, like your brain is so responsive to short-term dietary intake that we need to consider that. 5 days in a row of binging on ultra-processed foods, no bueno. You're getting fat around your liver. Now you can lose that, right, with the exercise and stuff. But it's important to remind yourself that, hey, these processed foods, they actually are doing something bad. They really are. So that would be at the top of the list, along with just like overeating and inflammation, right? So we're talking about like what's causing inflammation in the body, what kind of diets cause it. Certainly being sedentary. Like if you're sedentary, you're going to have chronic levels of inflammation. Like exercise causes this like acute burst of inflammation. IL-6 is like this cytokine that you make a lot during exercise, also during deliberate heat exposure from a sauna. And the body responds to it. It's an adaptation that happens. Is the body goes, whoa, I got this big bolus of inflammation. I need to have an anti-inflammatory response. And so exercise is one of the best things you can do for anti-inflammatory responses, right? But diet, the inflammatory response really, like, I think there's even studies showing that you can take healthy young men, give them a sugar-sweetened beverage for a week. So this is like a soda, equivalent to like a soda. And their inflammatory biomarkers go up by 100%, and it's like, it's immediate. So a lot of sugar in the body without a fiber matrix causes inflammation. High saturated fat without any sort of fiber. Like if you're just drinking cream or ice cream's the worst because it's got the sugar, but that can also cause inflammation as well. The high cream fat without any fiber matrix. So you really do want to mix your foods. You want to have like fiber with your fat, or you want to have like, if you're going to have saturated fat, have it with the protein, right? Like the meat, like not just eating the butter, right? Eating the butter by itself is not good. It's going to cause inflammation.
It's kind of, I always go back to, I remember Mike Mutzel and I were talking about, like, people don't really think about, like, we know of like a oral glucose tolerance test, but there is lipid tolerance too, right? And being able to, like, those chylomicrons can only take on so much, right? So it's like, if you're especially in a liquefied form, we used to, in the low carb space, it was very big to put your butter in your coffee and like do that. And like, there's evidence now that like a liquefied saturated fat is problematic, like that you're taking it a lot at one time. It's not to say don't have butter. It's saying like, hey, when you do put it in this liquid form, like there is an upper limit to what you can handle at one point in time. And the rest is really inflammatory.
Yes. So when you're just taking in straight saturated fat, and this is also the problem with processed foods because they have a lot of saturated fat, and also just fat, but they have a lot of saturated fat with sugar and no fiber. What happens is, there's a lot of bile acid production stuff that you need to like in the gut. And when you're digesting these fats, the fats also act as a detergent on your gut cells. You release a lot of lipopolysaccharide. These studies have been done in humans. If you give humans like cream, like just straight cream, high saturated fat, they have a huge polysaccharide response. And people might be going, what is that? So lipopolysaccharide after a meal, this is the postprandial inflammatory response. It's the inflammation that's generated after a meal. And it happens after every meal, but it particularly happens if you have a high sugar and or a really high fat meal without like protein or fiber. Because the lipopolysaccharide, which is it's a component of the outer membrane of bacteria that's in your gut. We have lots and lots of microbiome bacteria in our gut. When you and they're constantly dying, by the way, in our gut. They're alive and they're dead. So we have this lipopolysaccharide that is like sitting around in our gut. When we eat a meal, our gut becomes a little bit permeable, and so the lipopolysaccharide comes into our circulation. And this is the postprandial inflammatory response. And so we do know that high fat, especially high saturated fat and high sugar, can massively increase that post-inflammatory response after you eat a meal. Interestingly, if people, and these have been human studies, if people eat a lot of sugar or saturated fat and then they take in omega-3 fatty acids, it blunts that lipopolysaccharide response, that post-inflammatory response after a meal. I know, it's interesting.
That's wild.
It is. So it's happening at multiple levels. Obviously inflammation in general, omega-3s are resolving inflammation, but it's actually even happening at the level of the bacteria in the gut with the omega-3s. And it's in this whole complicated pathway, but it's essentially preventing the lipopolysaccharides being released into your circulation, which also is why it affects cholesterol, and it's like has all these positive effects on your lipids, and there's many mechanisms here. There's many mechanisms of why, but this is one that's not as well known.
Do you think, since we do have this postprandial LPS response, is this an argument for maybe not grazing all day too? Like having distinct breaks between meals, not even specifically fasting, but just eat, stop, then eat, instead of just like grazing and kind of constantly keeping your gut permeable?
It's hard. That's a good question. And it really does depend, because you can have a higher postprandial inflammatory response or post-inflammatory response after a meal if the meal is very big. That's also very hard on the gut. So in some ways, yes, because you are doing, if you're constantly especially if you're like grazing a little bit more heavier than just like a handful of nuts. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
Then I would say you're having more of that post-inflammatory response. But then again, that's why if you have a really big meal, you'll notice that you get really sleepy after, because the inflammation that's generated is basically causing that fatigue, right? There's a huge inflammatory response. A lot of people associate it with the glucose response, but the inflammatory response is what's causing the fatigue, because that's the activation of the immune system. When the lipopolysaccharides come out, the immune system is on alert. It is like, oh my gosh, there's bacteria. I got to fight this. And so that is part of the problem with having a really big meal.
That's so interesting. Where my mind goes with this is just anecdotally, and this could be the case. It could not be, but it's very interesting. Like if I have a cold or something like that, I feel significantly better if I just don't eat a whole lot. But I notice, this is without a shadow of a doubt, it happens every time. If I eat a significant amount while I have a cold or something, symptoms increase significantly for a while. The fatigue, the cytokine storm sort of. And it's, I recently, a few weeks ago, when I had a cold, and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to try something. I fueled up quite a bit at the beginning of it. And then I did a 48-hour fast, and there was like no symptoms during the fast. Then as soon as I broke the fast again, symptoms kind of came back a little bit, but it was just interesting. I really wanted to test that. I was curious, like what happens, and who knows, you can't take it to the bank for sure, but I've noticed so many times that like symptoms would increase after eating any amount, but the more food that I ate, the more intense the symptoms were, like stuffy your nose, things like that.
That's interesting. There's also some evidence that viral versus bacterial infections are different. And I think with the viral infections that if you're more in ketosis, it improves the like immune system and like the clearance of the virus as well. So there might be a combo of things happening here. Like for me, I like to be fasted if I'm doing a podcast. So like right now, I haven't eaten anything. I didn't eat breakfast. If I'm giving a presentation, I will not want to eat right before my presentation. Because of that post-inflammatory response that happens. And like I said, obviously, if you're an insulin-resistant state, it's worse. There's a lot of things that but it still happens. It happens to some degree in everyone. Like that's part. I mean, anyone's noticed that they're sharper when they're in a fasted state, and that also happens. That also plays a role. It's not just the ketones. Like so, you're making more. You're in ketosis, and the ketones are being used by your neurons, and that helps. With the energy and the utilization, and it kind of helps with all that. But also, the inflammation itself disrupts cognition. Inflammation disrupts cognition. That's like, again, all you have to do is think about when you're sick and think about, that's like the extreme case, right? You have fatigue, obviously, like because your inflammation, your immune system's extremely activated in that state. Your cognition,
your brain is
right. You're totally brain fog. Well, that's happening obviously to not that extreme of a degree, but that's happening to people that are chronically inflamed. So whether that's after a meal, you do have that post-inflammatory meal response. It's also one of the reasons why I like to have omega-3s with my meals. But it's also the visceral fat. And back to the visceral fat, these people are in a chronically inflamed state. Chronically inflamed. That visceral fat, as you mentioned, the first thing you said when you started this podcast, it's metabolically active. And that's absolutely right. It is a different kind of fat than our subcutaneous fat. It is metabolically active. It is producing inflammatory molecules, including cytokines. And that is constantly happening. So imagine the more visceral fat you have, the more inflamed you are. And it's going to affect your cognition. It's going to affect your mood. That's also been shown. Inflammation itself causes depressive symptoms. That's been done in healthy people. You inject healthy people with lipopolysaccharide or a placebo saline control. People that are injected with lipopolysaccharide don't know it. They experience depressive symptoms. People that are injected with saline do not. Inflammation causes depression in mood. I mean, it's absolutely associated with depression as well, right? Causally. So there's every reason. I mean, people want to feel better. People want to have more energy. People don't want to have cravings. People don't want to get cancer. They don't want to get type 2 diabetes, fatty liver. Like these are the things that, are all linked to visceral fat. And it all comes down to things that are within our control. Diet, lifestyle play a very important role in our ability to accumulate, visceral fat. Yes, as we age, that happens easier, as I mentioned, the hormonal reasons for that, but it's not a sure thing. You can counter it with exercise, with the high intensity exercise, the vigorous exercise, with not overeating, with not eating the kinds of foods that are high in sugar, refined sugar, and high in saturated fat, the processed foods that are going to make you overeat, that are going to make your brain insulin resistant, right? So I think there's a lot of hope out there for people that already have visceral fat to lose it, and for people that don't want to gain it, right? Like, especially as you're getting older and you don't want to have the visceral fat, or you don't want to be the metabolically unhealthy but lean person, right? Like those people, those are the worst because they don't know it. They think they're healthy. They think I'm not overweight, and they don't realize that they actually are metabolically unhealthy.
Yeah, you start bringing in the different, ectomorph, mesomorph, endomorph, all that stuff, that can sure play a role in like your overall body composition, but it doesn't seem to influence visceral fat accumulation as much. Like you can absolutely be an ectomorph that has a high amount of visceral fat.
Right.
What about alcohol?
Yes. Alcohol. We were talking about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. That's a mainlining fatty liver disease. The alcohol is absolutely going to make you accumulate visceral fat like at a very high rate. And that's why you hear the term beer belly, right? People that drink alcohol chronically, they get a gut. And so that's like, I mean, and all kinds of reasons.
Yeah, it makes sense. The estrogen reason too with beer, right?
Estrogen. I mean, there's so many different ways that it's affecting the accumulation of visceral fat that it's almost like ridiculous. Like if you drink alcohol, I mean, look, obviously, like it's fun once in a while. You have a social occasion, you might have a glass of wine or whatever. But like if you're drinking this like on a regular basis, that is not good.
Yeah.
Like that's absolutely going to make you have an accumulation of visceral fat.
Is it just making the acetaldehyde, or essentially the conversion of ethanol to that? Is it basically just making it so that the liver almost like the metabolism of everything else takes a backseat to the alcohol? Is that kind of what happens?
I mean, that is absolutely something that is contributing for sure. It's, you know, like I said, I think that, you know, there's so many different ways that alcohol is causing the body to accumulate that visceral fat. I mean, it's literally poking holes in the gut. It's causing that inflammation, that stress response, and affecting glucose regulation as well, insulin sensitivity, all that stuff. And I like the way that you described it as well with the, you know, basically like your liver, you're working your liver so hard and it's becoming inflamed too, right? And fibrosis and all that stuff. Like it's like you having to metabolize that alcohol, like everything else is like backseat.
Yeah, that takes priority because that's a little poison you're putting in your body. So your liver's going to deal with that.
Right. Yeah. You're going to deal with the poison that's right there. And everything else is like, well, I need to survive right now.
Yeah.
Like,
so let's store these triglycerides and
you store the fat right around the liver and it just starts to accumulate. Yeah. It's a big problem. So alcohol. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that one because it's like, I think about people that are healthy. Of course they're not drinking, but you know what? No, people do drink. And that is a big cause in a lot of people's accumulation of visceral fat. Like a lot of people have visceral fat because they drink pretty chronically.
Yeah.
And they might not even realize that. They think that it's like, oh, I drink, you know, a glass of wine a night.
Yeah.
Not good.
No, exactly. I mean,
not good for visceral fat and liver. And yeah, I mean,
plenty of literature about it. Unfortunately, in the younger generation, we're starting to see data now that like significantly less drinking, and so much to the point where now they're concerned about, have you seen this? They're concerned about, are younger people going to get the same social interaction that their parents did because alcohol is not as much of a factor.
They're not. I'm going to answer that for you. They're not, because yes, alcohol does lower inhibitions and you do like socialize around alcohol, but like the screens, right? And so, this is like this combining, I would say the biggest factor here is, I mean, I've gone to the mall and seen, like, I remember going to the mall as a kid and it was nothing but talk. I was talking to my friends.
It's quiet at the mall.
It's quiet. Everyone, the kids are on their phones, they're on their screens, and they're chatting with each other on the screen. It's the bizarrest thing. It's terrifying, to be honest. And I know that's completely off topic.
Well, no, there probably is a link there. I mean, when you start thinking of dopaminergic signaling and flicker and all these other things that probably do make a difference in the quality of sleep and all these things. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but at the same time, less about the blue light and more about just the constant signaling, right? The constant triggering, the constant dopamine hits. Oh, yeah. I notice a difference in my sleep if it's a day that I've been on a device more. Like I literally notice that. It's like, well, okay, I can tell a night by looking at my metrics when that was a day that I was in front of the box a lot. I was in front of the computer, or I was on my phone more, or I was traveling, and you just see the patterns. So you can only imagine, like, that probably does play a role. So even though it seems like a tangent, it's such a lifestyle that it does play a role.
It does play a role, especially with the sleep, as you mentioned. For people that are, the worst thing you could do for your sleep is be on your phone, and particularly social media, before you go to bed, because it's designed to keep you on it. It's designed for the dopamine hit. It's designed to excite you. And things that excite you before you go to bed are the opposite of what you want. You want to have that relaxation. You don't want to be binging on a Netflix show because you have to watch the next one to know what happens, right? Like that's the worst thing that you can do. And so being on your phone and on social media, where it's all like the whole purpose that all these social media, platforms their whole purpose is to keep you on them
Yeah.
and to keep you excited and to keep the dopamine going.
Of course.
You know, and so that's like, you know, I was talking to my coach yesterday. It's like, oh, how's it going? Oh, I didn't sleep well. I was on social media. I was up till 2 a.m. And I was like, why are you don't do that. Don't get on your phone before you go to bed.
Yeah, literally the worst thing you could do. Rhonda, a little bit of a pivot. What is your current stance on sauna? Has anything changed there?
My current stance on sauna, boy, that's a very general question. So I get a question a lot, infrared sauna versus hot sauna, like what's better? And my stance is still that a regular hot sauna is the best for cardiovascular benefits. So we're talking about improving your blood pressure, improving your cardiovascular disease risk. Like all the studies that have been done done with like hot saunas. And in fact, if you do a head-to-head comparison, same amount of time spent in an infrared sauna, which only gets up to about 145 degree versus a hot sauna, you're getting like 175 degree Fahrenheit. You don't get the same cardiovascular benefits. Like if you're staying in the same duration, you have to stay in much, much longer to get some cardiovascular benefits from infrared. I'm talking double at least. I would say anything that my mind has changed would be going really, really hot.
Okay.
And that is something I may have told you already, but I think that the literature now on, so cardiovascular benefits are great with sauna use, also brain benefits as well. So cardiovascular system is very intimately linked to the brain. Obviously, like blood pressure, you know, hypertension is a big, big risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, for dementia. And so you want to keep your cardiovascular system healthy. You want the blood flowing. You want the oxygen getting to your brain. You want all the nutrients getting to your brain, right? But also heat shock proteins are activated when you're under heat stress. So sauna use is one of the major ways you can actually activate heat shock proteins, as does exercise, anything that's elevating your core body temperature. However, you don't want the temperature to be so hot. So that there have been studies showing that, for example, people that use the sauna 4 to 7 times per week, this is 175 degree Fahrenheit sauna for about 20 minutes, have about a 66% lower risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease compared to people that use the sauna 1 time a week. There's a second study that was published, independent group, this is also out of Finland, showing, again, you do get a protective effect if you're using the sauna routinely. Dementia risk goes down, Alzheimer's disease risk goes down. But what's interesting about this study is that the researchers stratified that data according to sauna temperature. And what they found is that individuals that were below 200 degree Fahrenheit had those benefits of protective effects against dementia. If they started to go above 200 degree Fahrenheit, you know, the 212 degree Fahrenheit, you know, these people that are going hard go hard or go home, right? Those individuals actually increased their dementia and Alzheimer's disease risk. And I think this is, I wouldn't say it's kind of a change for me. I never was really going that hot, but at least now I know, I'm aware of that literature where I don't think you should be going into a 200 degree Fahrenheit sauna, certainly not 212, 215 degree Fahrenheit sauna. Your brain is in that sauna. Your head is getting cooked in there too. And we don't really know what the mechanism is. And like I said, this is only just one study. But I think it's enough. You don't have to go that hot. Like there's no literature out there showing that you get more benefits by going that hot. In fact, there's only something showing that you don't get benefits and in fact might get negative effects by going that hot. So I think that's the biggest thing that has changed for me is telling people that they shouldn't be going to 200 degree Fahrenheit if they're getting in a hot sauna. Yeah, that would be the thing for me. The other thing is also, I think that it can extend the endurance part of your workout. So going in the sauna after an endurance exercise, after endurance workout will improve your VO2 max more than just doing an aerobic type of workout. And that's been shown in a head-to-head study. Dr. Jari Laukkanen showed that if you took individuals, put them on a stationary bike, work them, for 30 minutes, and then half of the group went into the sauna for about 15 minutes after that, and the other half didn't. The group that did the exercise plus the sauna had greater improvements in VO2 max than the people that only did the exercise. I think that's really cool. People are always wondering when to sauna. So it's great to do it after an endurance workout, but it's also great to do after resistance training. And that's also a new study that came out showing that people that did resistance training again, if you took the two groups and you did resistance training only, and then the second group did the same resistance training workout, only they went into the sauna afterwards. And those individuals had greater biomarkers of anabolic signaling. So like different markers of basically muscle hypertrophy were found in the group that did the sauna on top of the resistance training. And this goes back to like, there's studies showing locally, if you take someone who's injured, if they have, if they're unable to use like their leg or their arm, and you do local heat, they're about 40% less likely they lose 40% less muscle than if they do nothing. Heat is through heat shock proteins. It is preventing, the degradation of proteins. So like kind of shifting that balance, muscle synthesis to degradation. Yeah. So
if you're in a situation where like you maybe can't get the resistance training in or something like that, like there is an argument to be had that like sauna can at least prevent some catabolism or atrophy.
Absolutely. Disuse atrophy. I would say there's evidence that, if you're injured and can't get in the sauna, and you can't exercise, then getting in the sauna will help prevent that disuse atrophy, along with omega-3 fatty acid use. That's another study that was done by Chris McGlory. This was in women, but women that were doing high dose omega-3. So they were doing about 5 grams a day. After 4 weeks, you have to like build it up in your muscle first. So it has to like accumulate in your muscle. It prevented disuse atrophy by like 50%.
Damn.
Pretty big. Huge implications for, surgery, for older adults. People that are convalescing because they have the flu or whatever, where they're just out. You're just out, right? Omega-3s and sauna. Big, I think, winners for preventing disuse atrophy.
Dang. Do you think that there is any link with sauna use and visceral fat reduction? I only say that because I've had Dr. Sean O'Mara on, and he doesn't have a ton of data to back it up, but he had some hypotheses. But he's a believer that fasted sprint training, reducing your longer duration like zone 2, not doing it, but reducing, like he found in his, so he does a lot of MRIs. Have you seen that? He's done like all these patients.
Like visceral fat, yeah.
And he was talking about how he was showing me, these are distance runners, these are people that sprint. And he's like, it's pretty compelling. As someone that was a distance runner, or still is to a certain degree, he made a really solid case for that. But then he also talks about sauna. He's not a big cold exposure guy. He's like, cold exposure, I think he and I are aligned in the sense that like, it's more about like the chronic moderate cold exposure than just like going and like trying to tough it out for, anyway, but he really thinks that sauna plays a big role in it. And I remember him mentioning some of the mechanisms were just, again, prolonging the exercise or being able to do your interval training and then get your aerobic work from your sauna, on that same day. I don't know if, what your take is on that as someone that really studies a lot of sauna research, if you think that's plausible there.
I do think it's plausible. I think that the sauna itself isn't going to make you lose visceral fat. It does mimic moderate intensity physical activity, very moderate, And so, maybe a little bit, but I would say that you have to probably combine it with your exercise, and it's going to amplify it. That would make sense. Certainly from just knowing how you can, again, amplify the endurance, like aerobic performance enhancements, right? Like VO2 max. And even like, people that do, so endurance athletes that add sauna in, they can actually improve their endurance enhancements as well. So I do think that there's an argument to be made to adding it to your exercise routine in terms of losing visceral fat. And there was one recent study showing that it did somewhat decrease fat mass as well. It's just one small study.
Yeah.
But so I think that there is an argument to be made there. Also, again, I don't think just doing it by itself is going to be like the main lever that you pull. But I'm curious like what mechanisms were proposed. I can just see the basically it's extending the duration, amplifying the effect of your aerobic exercise workout is what I see the main thing as an amplifier.
Yeah, that's his main argument too. That, and he has some, he tries to go from an evolutionary lens where he's trying to like, acute stressors all the time, right? Like, so he thinks of all these different ways he can have acute stressors, and he's basically just aggregating patient data, right? Because he's just got all these MRIs. He's got the largest like bank of MRI scans in this. So he's just, with his interesting mind, he's just like getting through all this data, and he's just like, these are the things that I'm seeing on people that have these acute stressors. And then you look at like corporate executives that are chronically stressed, and they're so stressed that the idea of adding more stress with an intense workout is hard. So they become like default to this endurance work. You see that a lot. And if you actually think about that, that does make sense. A lot of those people, that's what they do. Those are the people that might end up, even men, they're just on the treadmill or something like that. They're just, because it's easier for their mind. Their mind's already taxed. It's hard when you're super stressed to get that, like, you need to retrain your mind. I've had to retrain my mind. It's like, this is how I blow off steam. This is how I get that visceral response, no pun intended, of just, but yeah, he says, okay, these people that are chronically stressed, a lot of times they default to this like lower intensity cardio as their norm, and like look at what happens to their visceral fat. He's like, we can actually increase their amount of just pure endurance work without resistance training or high intensity interval training, and actually see increases in their visceral fat. And he has an evolutionary argument that it's, again, like when you're in that situation, your body starts like storing it more. I can't remember exactly what he said. We had the interview a couple of years ago, and it was interesting. He basically thinks that just doing endurance work without high intensity interval training could potentially make you store more, even if you're lean on the outside, but potentially have more visceral fat on the inside. So pretty fascinating.
Well, from the scientific literature with like randomized controlled trials, I don't know what kind of like how he defines the endurance, but like if you're doing like jogging or cycling, people do lose visceral fat. So
I'm sure he's probably talking more so. I mean, he showed me a couple of scans. It's interesting. I wonder, even for the sake of this video, I might be able to clip it just so to add it in there. It's kind of interesting because I don't remember exactly what he said.
In this particular case, is we noticed an individual who had accumulated a large amount of visceral fat. They came to us. They were 58 years old. They were CEO of a company. And so they had a lot of stress because they ran this company. Now, here's the interesting thing that was captured in this particular individual. This guy was given our strategies that we identified for the National Science Foundation to eliminate this visceral fat. Now, in this case, this is a follow-up scan, and I'll just tell you, and everybody's following along, that his original scan, which was about 2 months or a month and a half before this one, looked exactly the same. The things that we saw caused visceral fat to stay on and make the strategies not work. And if your audience may not like this, but I'm just going to tell you, distance running, durational exercise. When you do long, too much exercise, it makes it very hard to get rid of this visceral fat. So what we found works better is stress hormesis in a very short, maximal, intensive manner, but a very short period of time. Mm-hmm. So to your question, that's what gets rid of visceral fat. When you sprint, when you worked out like we were working out this morning, I almost puked 3 times in a short period of time. But when we got this guy to give up distance running, he was doing 10 miles a day, 5 times a week, so 50 miles. And we got him to stop it at the threat of being kicked out of the study and no more free MRIs and no more exams by physicians. He switched to sprinting, and from February 6th to April 3rd, not even 2 months, just shy of 2 months, look at the dramatic reduction in his visceral fat.
I mean, I guess the caveat is that people only have so much time, right? I don't think that, in my opinion, that maybe doing some distance work or whatever is deleterious. In my opinion, it's probably just the absence of the intense stuff.
But it definitely had mentioned it, and he used one case study in particular. So just curious your take on.
What's interesting is you were talking about like these chronically stressed individuals, like that, like high performers or whatever, if they're like, CEO, whatever these chronically stressed people are. Doing the thing that is hardest for you, and you kind of alluded to this earlier where you said we talk about like difference between men and women. Like women, what's harder for women is resistance training.
Yeah.
What's harder for men is HIIT, or like doing like more high intensity training, right? So doing whatever's harder for you is something that's really recommended to help you deal with your stress, because when you can do that hard thing, you're training your brain. You're able to handle that like stress, and so the work related stress becomes less stressful. I mean, this is something that like almost everyone. I experienced it with adding a lot of weight training and starting my weight training over a year ago. But it's like you're training your brain to do the really hard things so that the other hard things actually aren't as hard. It's funny, the sauna for me, I first got into the sauna when I was a graduate student back in 2009, 2008, 2009. I was doing the sauna every single morning before I would go into the lab. This was before anyone started talking about saunas. This was like, like this it wasn't really as popular back then. I mean, started doing it in about 2007, but like 2008, 2009 was a very stressful period for me. And I was a graduate student, a lot of failed experiments, just a lot of pressure, right? And I started going to the sauna before I would go into the lab. And that's when it clicked and I realized that I was able to handle the stress of my day, of being a graduate student, of all the failed experiments, of how hard everything was. I was able to handle it like exponentially better. I mean, this is like the kind of thing that you notice where you're like, did I just take a drug? What is going on? And that's what got me, the thing that got me interested in the sauna was the effect on my brain and my ability to handle stress. Yeah. And that's what I went down the rabbit hole and started to I was looking into endorphins and looking into, you do release a lot of beta endorphins when you are exercising, but also when you're in the sauna, again, mimicking moderate intensity aerobic activity. Well, the other thing that you're doing is you are causing a opposite response as well. So you're having something called dynorphin. This is the opposite of endorphin. So dynorphin is our endogenous kappa opioid. It's responsible for that dysphoric feeling when you're hot, when you're uncomfortable, when you're going hard on a HIIT, when you're on a long endurance run and you're feeling uncomfortable. That is dynorphin being produced in your brain. And the reason for dynorphin, that discomfort is really important because what it does is everything's a feedback loop, right? There's adaptations that's happening. So the dynorphin is acting on a receptor, a kappa opioid receptor. And when that receptor is activated, it causes the receptors that are bind to our endorphins, the feel-good endorphins, they're called mu opioid receptors, they become more sensitive. When your body has the discomfort, it adapts and go, I need to be more responsive to the good stuff because I don't feel good right now. And so you become more sensitive to it. You make more of them, and you basically experience the endorphins for a longer period. So anything that makes you feel good, whether it's like seeing your child, kissing your spouse, a hug, a kind friend, a word, whatever it is that gives that little endorphin, you're going to feel it more after you get in the sauna or you exercise. And that's why so many people, myself included, I'm that brain type that I have to get the exercise to recalibrate my brain. It's a blessing in a way. I think people like that. They really can have a regimented routine, right? Because you feel the effects of exercise so much on your brain. Where you're like, if I don't have this, I can't function at the level I want to. Whereas other people may not be the same personality type. They may already be kind of happy, and it's like exercise isn't doing that necessarily that big thing, but to some degree it does. And I just mentioned that whole mu kappa opioid kind of feedback loop, and I published on that in my sauna review that I published in 2018. But I think it's just one reason why the sauna is so important for our ability to handle stress. And I also collaborated with Dr. Ashley Mason at UCSF, and she's doing multiple studies now. But, she's now taken the work of Dr. Charles Raison, who originally showed that you could take people with major depressive disorder and essentially give them this, sauna effect, where at the time they used this hyperthermia. So this machine that basically elevated their core body temperature to like a feverish state, like a degree and a half. Or they had a sham control, what was enough to make people think they were getting hot, but it wasn't like they weren't getting that degree and a half elevation in core body temperature. And those people only did it once with major depressive disorder, and they had an antidepressant effect that lasted 6 weeks after that, whereas the placebo group or the sham control group did not experience that. She went on and showed if you did multiple times 4 or 8 treatments in combination with cognitive behavioral therapy, that those individuals with major depressive disorder experienced such a change in there's a battery of tests that are done. Typically, it's like the Hamilton scale of depression. And if you get like a 3-point change in that scale, it's considered like clinically relevant. These people were getting like a 16 to 18 point change. I mean, it was huge. So again, coming down to the effects of the sauna, and I know I went on a tangent, but I just love this.
That stuff's cool. Yeah.
The effects of the sauna, heat stress, deliberate heat exposure. Obviously, exercise ties into that as well because you are also, that's doing a very similar thing. It's affecting your brain. It's affecting your ability of your brain to handle stress. It's affecting your mood. It's affecting the way you feel weeks out. And again, coming down to the endorphins, like you're more sensitive to them. So everything's better. Everything feels better.
Is there an effect on the glymphatic system too, in terms of like intracranial pressure? Like you're creating a kind of a gradient, right? Because you're creating this heat, and it's like something that's your literal brainwashing, right? Like flushing metabolites and getting waste products. Like does the sauna change that?
I think it does. So there's only animal evidence of this. And I think, so you're talking about the glymphatic system. This is something that normally is only active during sleep, right? When we're sleeping, the cerebral spinal fluid is basically being pushed into our brain, and it's like clearing out all this like waste, whether it's like a, damaged cell or a dead cell or a piece of DNA chunk or amyloid plaques accumulating, whatever the trash is, it's taking it out. And it was thought that okay, well, sleep, and not only just sleep, but deep sleep. It seems to be the specific stage of sleep that's very important for the activation of that glymphatic system. And then that was thought to be the only time that this system's active. Well, it turns out that there's now animal research showing that exercise, and there's even some new data with heat showing that you can actually activate the glymphatic system through those mechanisms. So I think, yes, why wouldn't that happen in humans? I'm sure people out there are going to want to say, show me the evidence. And I'll tell them, well, I was out there talking about heat shock proteins and all the little mice being exposed to little mouse saunas and how it prevented disuse atrophy in them. Guess what? We showed it in humans, years later. I do think that's probably something that's evolutionarily conserved in humans as well. So I think, yes, I do think the sauna, anything that's increasing blood flow, increasing the blood flow, I mean, you're also going to be increasing the lymphatic system as well. Like, it makes sense.
No, totally. Right? I mean, I first learned about sauna and the glymphatic system from my work with the Special Forces groups and post-TBI. And they were literally referencing the animal data saying, like, if it's probably part of what we need, right? So it was like, yeah, we can't prove this in humans, but it was strong enough for them to say, hey, well, there's low risk and extremely high reward, and this is an extremely plausible mechanism that only has upside.
Exactly. Especially when you have an intervention that only has that has benefits. Now, yeah, if you stay in the sauna for like 3 hours, that's going to be best. If you go into a 212-degree sauna for like 30 minutes over and over, you're probably not good. But you shouldn't exercise like all day, every day either.
Yeah.
Any kind of stress, the dose makes the poison, right? So yeah, I mean, when you're talking about something like the sauna where you're getting massive benefits, like why wouldn't you look at an animal study and go, oh, it's activating the glymphatic system. Probably it's doing that in humans too. That's another reason why we should do it. Like the way I work is like I get motivated when I understand how something works.
Same.
And that's why you and I love mechanism.
Yep. And we catch crap for it too. But you know what? We're not here saying it's the only way. It's just, when I know how it works, I can kick into that gear and it gives me a seventh gear that I didn't know I had, because I'm just like, I don't know. Sometimes I visualize that happening, and it's fascinating to me, and I get passionate about it because observational data is great. Show me the RCTs. Trust me, I love all that stuff. That stuff is great. But there's many times those things end up proving these mechanisms that I got so excited about in the first place.
Right. I agree. Like even with this looking at how eating highly processed foods over just 5-day period can cause brain insulin resistance and, accumulation of visceral fat and fat around your liver. to me, like learning that is very motivating because it's very easy to default and say, I can cheat a little bit. I can eat these, foods and I'm not gaining weight. I'm fine. I'm healthy. I work out. And of course, exercise and all that helps. But at the end of the day, and it's not like they told those people not to exercise. They were consuming more calories, of course. So they were in a caloric excess. But, at the end of the day, like these were healthy young men and they were able to do that. For me, it was very motivating, particularly because I have an ApoE4 allele, which increases my risk for Alzheimer's disease. And this is interesting, the ApoE4 allele, so 25% of the population has one of these alleles. If you have one, you have about a twofold increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. That doesn't mean you're going to get it because a lot of lifestyle factors play a role here. Being, exercise being at the top, not consuming excess alcohol, not being obese, like all those things help. But if you have two alleles, that increases your risk to like 10, 11-fold, like really big problem. It's not very common to have two. It's like 1% to 2% of the population has like both alleles. But the ApoE4 also tends to make the brain become more insulin resistant easier. And so if you're ApoE4 and you're eating those foods, you're getting a little bit of a double whammy. And so I have to be even more careful about the foods that I consume because I don't want to cause that insulin resistance in my brain, which of course is linked to Alzheimer's disease and visceral fat, right? In the whole cycle. So again, I think when you understand mechanism, and you and I aren't the only people out there like that. I think there are a lot of people that
Chris Masterjohn, you got all these people that love mechanism. So
right.
Yeah.
And just people that are motivated that don't have a degree and aren't, talking about it, but that are motivated by understanding something. And then they're like, I'm going to really make sure that I try to, make sure I'm not increasing my visceral fat, make sure I'm not eating processed foods because even though I'm in a caloric deficit or maybe they're still having somewhat of an effect.
I think it's like any classical, like engineer-brained person, right? Like I take my son versus my daughter. My son is very engineer brain. He wants to know how it works. And once he knows how it works, he's into it. And I think that like you talk to lots of adults that are like that and you get them excited about how the body works. Then they're like, oh, I appreciate this organism. I appreciate this vessel that I'm in, right? And it's not just a, random, thing that's happening. Like there's systems that are happening, and when you understand that, it gets you excited about it. And who cares if occasionally it's not right, if you're not hurting, you're not hurting something. You're just like implementing these things because you're like, I know what this is doing in my body right now.
Absolutely.
Regarding sauna, do you feel that sauna in a fasted state versus a fed state makes a difference?
For what?
Let's start even from, or actually, we'll come back to that question. Let's talk, from a detoxification perspective, is there merit to sauna to actually detox? Like, can we clear things? Because one of the things I want to talk to you about was not just microplastics, but plastics in general. And this is a good segue into that. We don't have to talk plastics specifically in this question, but I am curious because people kind of say, well, no, you can't actually detox through sweat. Can you? And does a sauna work for that?
So that's an interesting question. We have a variety of different ways that our body can get rid of toxic compounds, this so-called detoxification, urine being a big one. So we excrete things through our urine, but also through sweat and then through our feces as well. Things come out through feces. And so, those are like some of the major players here with respect to getting rid of toxic compounds. Sweat, urine, feces, different types of toxic compounds are excreted through different pathways. So, for example, if we're talking about bisphenol A, this is a plastic-associated chemical. It's an endocrine disruptor. It is associated with all kinds of problems from cancer to fat accumulation to autism spectrum disorder if we're talking about, being exposed in utero during pregnancy. The major route of excretion for that is actually urine. Urine would be the major route. But if we're talking about aluminum, for example, aluminum is excreted through sweat, mostly. It's also excreted through urine. And BPA can be excreted through sweat somewhat as well. But the major way is through, either, so if we're talking about aluminum, it would be sweat, or BPA would be urine. So if you're in the sauna and you're sweating, then you're going to excrete. Obviously, you're going to be losing electrolytes like sodium. That's a big thing that you actually do excrete through the sauna. But if we're talking about toxic chemicals, you're going to be excreting ones that are preferentially excreted through sweat. So I think another one is cadmium as well, aluminum. And then you do lose some things like BPA, and some of these plastic chemicals do come out somewhat of sweat, but it's not the major way that you're going to get rid of them. It's just you're gonna get a little extra. You'll squeeze a little bit more of that water out of the cloth, right?
Got it.
So yeah, you will be excreting, but you do have to sweat. You do have to sweat when you're in the sauna. You can't just get in there and not sweat, right?
Yeah. And I guess that dovetails into the question about sauna in a fasted state, because that was going to be my next question. Is I would imagine if you're in a fasted state, it might help with fat mobilization, with a little bit of lipolysis or possibly that turnover, which was sort of dovetail with, do we store fat or toxins in our fat? And does that liberation potentially help in the same way that maybe cardiovascular exercise helps?
Yeah, I do think, we do store some toxins in our fat, right? And so liberating them is a mode of getting rid of them. There's not a whole lot of evidence. I mentioned one study with the sauna helping increase or decrease fat, which would presumably means that you're undergoing lipolysis and getting rid of fat, right? I would say my major way of thinking about the detoxing with either in a fasted state with exercise or in a fasted state with the sauna is more about the autophagy and the clearing away of damaged stuff within our cells. And I think that there is an argument there that if you're combining the fasted state with the exercise, there's not really a lot of evidence with the sauna, but if you were to connect the dots and go, well, sauna is a type of moderate intensity exercise, then you might presume that you would be probably increasing some of that, activating that system a little bit more robust.
You would be. You're elevating AMPK for sure.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So the literature out there has shown that, like, if you do aerobic exercise in a fasted state, you do increase lipolysis more than if you're just doing aerobic exercise in a fed state. Mm-hmm. So you are going to burn more fat, right? If that's your goal, that's going to happen more if you're in a fasted state. It's also evidence that you will, boost the autophagy signals more too. And again, the more vigorous the intensity of the exercise, the more you're overpowering everything, because that in it itself is a really strong signal for autophagy and also mitophagy, clearing away damaged mitochondria. But I think the combination of the two are probably going to be, more robust than just one by itself. And I certainly don't think that sauna by itself is a big lipolysis activator.
No, I don't think you're going into a sauna for specific fat loss, but I would imagine that I could make an argument that, like, after, a 5 or 6 mile run, you go sit in the sauna for 20 minutes. It might be the equivalent of adding another quarter mile or half mile on your run or something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like, the way I think of it is doing a sauna after an aerobic exercise workout is extending the workout. First of all, your heart rate's already elevated, so it doesn't take long. All of a sudden you get in that sauna, it's already elevated. And you're already hot and sweaty. So those mechanisms are really, like, kicked in. Like, everything's just amplified. So it really is like extending your workout. And that's probably why Dr. Jari Laukkanen's study showed that you could improve VO2 max greater than cycling alone if you followed the cycling with the sauna, right? It's amplifying it. It's extending that workout.
Yeah, which is, that's powerful. And I feel like, maybe it's from a blood flow perspective, but I do feel like it kickstarts recovery for me. Maybe could just be anecdotal, but it feels like it starts I'm getting the benefits of the exercise while simultaneously kickstarting the recovery process.
For sure, kickstarting recovery. Again, and some of this data, this is well known that increasing blood flow to the muscles, it will improve recovery. That's like a fact. If I am doing my squats or deadlifts and I do like a pretty hard workout, and I run the next day and sauna the next day, I bounce back so much quicker. And it's clearly like I'm getting everything that needs to go to the muscle by increasing the blood flow, right? And that's what you're doing. That's what you're doing when you're doing aerobic exercise, when you're doing the sauna. What
about if you're sick? We're talking just like simple cold flu type stuff. Is there benefit if you're not stressing the heck out of your body and like going in crazy hot?
First of all, I think there's absolutely a benefit. And, there's even studies showing that if people that use the sauna 4 to 7 times a week are like, 40% less likely to come down with pneumonia compared to people that use it 1 time a week. There's a lot of reason. There's immune related effects with the sauna, just like exercise, like very, very similar. Again, we're talking about like very similar things here. Sauna is like, in many ways, a moderate intensity aerobic workout. There's been a head-to-head comparison of that. So we know it's doing the same things that like, doing, for example, like 100 watts on a cycle would do, right? And that's just if you're staying in there for like 20 minutes. Like you go longer, it gets a little bit more intense, right? So it used to be thought for many, many, years that if you exercise, that you basically shouldn't do that if you're sick, because people noticed that exercise caused immune cells to dip. Like if you measure immune cells in your blood, in your circulation, you'll see a decrease after exercise. And so I would say for a period of many years, there was this advice out there that was, oh, you should not exercise if you're sick because like you're gonna dampen your immune system. Turns out, once we had more fancy techniques that were able to follow the immune cells and look in other tissues, the dip in immune cells in the circulation was because the immune cells were immobilizing and going to the lungs. Going to the lungs, right? So you actually want, if you have a respiratory virus, you want immune cells to go to the lungs to fight that off. And so, yeah, you don't want to like go all out and totally stress yourself, because then that's too much, right? Too much stress is not good. But even somewhat aerobic exercise and some sauna, I personally think are great to do if you're sick, as long as you aren't going super, super hard. Like when I'm sick, I do a pretty moderate intensity Peloton workout where I'll even do my HIIT workouts, but I just take it down a notch where I'm not going as hard on my intervals. But I'm like, so I can probably have some sentences that I do breathy while I'm doing it. So I do a little bit more of a moderate intensity workout for me when I'm sick. It makes a 10-minute workout makes a big difference for me. I recover so much better. My symptoms are better. I get stuff out, and then I get in the sauna again. And it's like, and I don't make it really, really hot. So I'm doing like 174, it's really like not that hot. And then I'll do some steam and breathe in the steam. And it's amazing. I really, 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 and like I said, there's data to back it up. Yeah. I think that the fact of the matter is that like people that are using the sauna frequently are like 40% less likely to get pneumonia. Like that's pretty profound.
That's profound. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not small stuff.
And we also know that it is affecting the immune system as well in a very similar way that exercise is. And so I don't know that anyone's done this. No one has done the studies looking at what happens to immune cells after sauna, but we do know after aerobic exercise that they're going to the lungs. And they eventually come back. Yeah. So, this temporary dip it's not like they're dying. They're actually just going to the lungs. Probably because it's like a stressful thing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And the dose would make the poison. We're not saying do anything crazy. And I've tested this sort of on myself where I've tried to just lay super, super low and not move when I'm sick. Here, let me try this. It's like, you got small kids, you get it. Or it's like I've got small kids, so it's gotten much better now that they're 8 and 5, but it's like through that phase of like when they were like 5 and 3, it was just like, oh my gosh, like here we go. It's like this, and so I had lots of opportunities to test different things, and without fail, like doing a little bit of movement cleared things faster. And if I would not do the movement, it's like it added 2 days to the cold. Okay. Like it's significant for me. So there's definitely something there.
I've tested it many times as well, and it's the same thing for me. Like you have this tendency to want to not do anything. And obviously, like if you have the flu and a fever, like, yeah, you're going to be like sleeping.
Yeah, if you're fatigued and you can't do it, it's different.
Right. Yeah. Right. A cold, we're talking is a game changer. Like I have to work out. Like, and I'll even before I get on an airplane, I'll get on my Peloton. I'll do a 10-minute HIIT before I get on the airplane. And I swear, I don't know if it's placebo, but it really does help not get sick.
That's a good point. That's interesting.
Again, you're getting it to the lungs. You're getting the immune cells to the lungs and stuff. And that's like a local effect that you're getting, right? Like to help you like fight it off immediately.
Interesting.
So
Yeah, and it's a lot of the same premise as like why people would take like thyroxine alpha-1, right? Like you're just getting an upregulated response with some of that's really interesting to do that. I'm gonna have to try that. Yeah, get a little bit of like respiratory action going.
that and my
first.
glutamine. I told you about my glutamine.
Glutamine, yeah, you and I are both hot on glutamine. That's I think for anyone that trains with relative intensity, like speaking of permeable gut, right? Like that has been one of the biggest game-changing supplements for me. And let's actually talk about that for a second, because I think people get confused on the glutamine and cancer risk thing and glutamine for, gut cell fuel and like repairing the gut. Like, can you touch on that for a minute?
Yeah. I mean, so glutamine is interesting because it's an amino acid. It's converted into energy, alpha ketoglutarate for the mitochondria, and it's converted into a neurotransmitter, glutamate. So glutamine is got all these pathways that it could go to. It's a very interesting thing, to consume. So I am super interested in glutamine because of the energy part of it.
Okay.
Because I know from all my research in graduate school, I did a lot of work with immune cells, that immune cells love glutamine. They love it. They use it, they take it up, they convert it into alpha ketoglutarate, and they use it for energy. Activated immune cells love glutamine. So that is something that kind of stuck with me in the back of my mind for a long time. With respect to the gut, same thing. It's energy, immediate energy right there. Like anything that can go and improve mitochondrial function in the gut is beneficial for the gut, whether it's glutamine. Malate is another one that goes right in. So we're talking about things that feed into like what's called the citric acid cycle, right? So that would be glutamine, alpha ketoglutarate gets converted to alpha ketoglutarate, malate, citrate, so these are things that are could be short chain fatty acids, malic acid. So if you're eating fruits like cherries or green apples that are sour, malic acid, that sour taste, that stuff is good for the gut because, and my former colleague and friend Mark Shignaga did a lot of this research at Children's Hospital Oakland Research Institute, where he was looking at all these glutamine, looking at malate, citrate, all these effects of these short chain fatty acids on gut health, and they do prevent. They help heal the gut, and they prevent lipopolysaccharide release as well. So the way it's doing it is by providing, again, a very quick source of energy that's used by the gut epithelial cells to heal. The cancer thing, where people get worried, is because I mentioned that immune cells love immune cells love glutamine because it's an energy source. Well, cancer cells have found a way to use glutamine as well as an energy source. So you can take a cancer cell, and I've done many of these experiments in the lab before in graduate school, and you can remove glucose from their milieu, and some of them will die because it is a stress to remove glucose. But if there's glutamine in there, a lot of them will keep going. They will keep proliferating because glutamine gives them that energy, that energetic source. When it comes to taking glutamine in cancer, I would say if you have colon cancer, like at the level of the gut, probably don't want to be taking glutamine, right? If you have liver cancer, because you can go straight to the liver, right? The liver is like one of the first organs that sees all the stuff after the gut. So, those are the two types of cancer that I would be concerned with. But you'd have to be taking a lot of glutamine, and you have to already have existing cancer to really be worried about that. I personally take, on a daily basis, I take 5 grams a day.
Okay.
And then when I'm like exposed, or if I'm like working out hard, I'll up that to 10.
Okay, so you take more when you're exposed to something too.
Oh yeah.
Okay, cool.
Oh yeah.
I've only been taking it.
Actually, I up it more to 10. More like 30.
Okay.
Yeah. The only side effect for me is like gas.
Yeah.
Like it'll give you gas.
It's negligible. It's not it's interesting because there's lots of evidence in the endurance sports world with glutamine, right? Because that's like one of the first things that we get gut mucosal breakdown, like with, it doesn't even have to be that much endurance work. I know they've like looked at the, the marathon training and things like that, but it's measurable even in CrossFit level, like, where you're doing any significant volume above just like, what we would consider like the recommended amount of exercise. So any significant amount, like if you're someone that's like, hey, do a CrossFit workout 3 or 4 times per week, and then I run a couple miles, but you are probably going to benefit from taking glutamine in.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think anyone that's doing CrossFit or any kind of HIIT or any kind of large volume endurance training will benefit from glutamine. And you're talking about the studies, endurance athletes. Endurance athletes, a lot of those studies that they're doing large volumes, these are the marathon runners and stuff, they are very prone to respiratory illness as well. And so the glutamine, I think, and that literature has been shown when these endurance athletes take the glutamine, they get fewer respiratory tract infections. With respect to the gut, again, it comes down to like, it is so easy for the gut to like take up the glutamine and use it for energy and heal. So it's really like a fast acting, and the same goes for like if you were to take malic acid or citric acid as well. It does the same thing. So there's all the reason for like anyone who's doing, again, like any type of like high volume or high intensity type of training to take glutamine. I also give it to my son, and just for prevention, for illness, because again, it comes to the immune cells taking it as well. So yeah, the gut's taking some of it, but the immune cells are also getting some of it, and it has worked for me. I've really it's made a big difference in my susceptibility to illness as well. So
is there a downside to taking a higher amount every day, or does it make a difference to like titrate based on exposure, or is it really just a waste otherwise, just a waste of money?
I mean, I think it depends again on like your level of gut illness too, like people that have leaky gut or Crohn's or, ulcerative colitis, this IBD, right? Those individuals would benefit from taking like a higher daily dose of glutamine. But like for like us everyday people that don't have IBD, not, taking enough to like help with the workouts and stuff, I think even 5 grams is probably good.
Yeah.
But I think there's an argument to titrate when you are exposed, or you have a really like heavy workout that you did, right? Where it's like really like you went harder than usual or something like that.
Yeah, no, it's definitely noticeable. I want to talk plastics for just a moment though, because we mentioned earlier about BPA and excreting it through the urine. First off, what is the difference between like a microplastic and like, plastic toxins? Like, because there's a difference. And do we have any ways to potentially expedite the clearance of either one of those?
Mm-hmm. So microplastics are the product of the breakdown of larger plastic. And so this happens with 2 factors. One, over time, oxidation, heat, anything that increases oxidation breaks down the plastic. And these microplastics range in size, from 5 micrometers down to like the nanometer size, right? So there's the microplastics and the nanoplastics. And the smaller they get, the more dangerous they get because they can go across membranes easier. But, you can have something that's a microplastic that's the size of, a piece of rice. That's a microplastic, or down to like the size, smaller than the size of a grade of sand, smaller to things that you can't even see, right? So that would be a microplastic. The plastic associated chemicals are the chemicals that are put into the plastic to make them more durable, to make them more flexible, to give them all the properties that they need. And those include a lot of the common ones that we've heard of, like bisphenol A, BPA, or the replacement. When you see something that's BPA free, it usually has something in it called BPS. We now know BPS is just as bad as BPA, perhaps even worse. So when you hear the word BPA free, it's 100% marketing, brilliant marketing. People think it's like safe. It's not. Yeah. It has other chemicals. Phthalates being another one. Phthalates are a big problem, particularly during development. They play a role in urogenital disorders. So like it's terrible. Women that are exposed to a lot of phthalates during pregnancy have boys that have hypospadia. So their urethra slit is like further back. And so a lot of times they'll have to sit on the toilet to pee because they don't have the right stream. Undescended testicles is another big one for phthalate exposure during pregnancy. And these things are very common. I mean, like 20% of boys nowadays have undescended testicle. And this is affecting fertility. It affects testicular cancer risk. It affects cancer risk in general. Phthalates affect cancer risk in general. So the point is that these plastic-associated chemicals are problematic. So are the microplastics. These things are accumulating in our heart, in our brain. They're associated with Alzheimer's disease, cardiovascular disease. They cause inflammation, much like that visceral fat. And it's a chronic inflammatory signal that's happening, right? So our body processes these these types of toxins differently. So people want to know, well, how do I detox some microplastic, right? First of all, we're being exposed to these plastic chemicals like constantly, like everywhere. Like even if you're doing everything that you can, you're getting them in your body. Like it's impossible to avoid. It's impossible. Now you can reduce your exposure. That's the best thing to do. But if you have been exposed, people want to know, well, can I detox of microplastics? And I would tell you that right now, there's no really good, safe way that's known to do that. Your best bet is, because microplastics and nanoplastics, when you consume them through water or food, if you're consuming them through water, you're going to want to eat it with food after you hear what I'm about to say, because microplastics are excreted through feces. That's the way you get rid of microplastics. They don't come out your urine. You're not sweating out microplastics. They come out feces. And so the way to get rid of microplastics is to not absorb them, essentially. So if you're consuming them, you want them to go straight out your feces, right? And that does happen, except for the fact that it depends on the size of the microplastic. So the smaller the size of the microplastic, it really can cross the membranes of your epithelial cells lining your gut very easy. And that's where fiber comes into play. Fiber is your best bet against microplastics right now because of two reasons. First and foremost, if you have insoluble fiber, right, that's the stuff that is moving food through you quicker. Vegetables are a great source of insoluble fiber. That is going to move the microplastics. It's going to not allow them to have the time to be absorbed. So it moves it through faster. You will poop out more microplastics with more insoluble fiber. The soluble fiber, or the fermentable fiber as it's now called, this is the kind of fiber that is found in a lot of fruits, or it's found in like artichokes or onions, inulin. It's found in beta-glucans and mushrooms and oats, right? Like this type of fiber that's fermented, it's that beneficial prebiotic that we hear about. It's the stuff that our good bacteria like to consume and ferment, and it makes more of the good bacteria. Well, the other thing that it does is it causes, this is why it used to be called soluble fiber. It's kind of now called fermentable fiber. The reason it's called soluble fiber is because it makes this viscous coating in the gut. And that becomes very important in understanding nanoplastics, because it coats the microplastics and nanoplastics and kind of prevents them from being able to get across the gut membrane. So you will move it through your feces rather than absorb it through your gut epithelial cells. So you want to get a combination of both soluble and insoluble fiber to basically poop out the plastic, essentially. That's what you want to do. And right now, that's your best bet. Better than any other stuff you're going to hear online. That is the best way that you're going to, quote unquote, excrete microplastics. You're going to excrete them through your poop. That's what you're going to do.
Exactly what I've said too. Yeah, and I know there's a little bit of there's a bile acid segregation, right? So it's like a little bit of soluble fiber with possibly some fat, right?
Yes. So
that's basically eat some. I mean, I would say like chia flaxseed, right? Something like that. I mean, again, you could go down the phytoestrogen rabbit hole with flax, but the point is, like, you get a little bit of fat, a little bit of soluble fiber, you've got a perfect little mix right there.
Right.
Yeah.
And that kind of dovetails into the chemicals, because some of these plastic associated chemicals are also excreted differently. So the BPA, the BPS, the phthalates, those are being excreted through urine. And the way to increase that excretion is you want to activate the enzymes that cause BPA to become soluble. BPA is not soluble. It's not water soluble. It has to get converted in the body to a water soluble metabolite, and that's how it's excreted. And the enzymes that do that are activated by my favorite compound found in broccoli and broccoli sprouts, sulforaphane. So the enzymes that activate, that basically make BPA water soluble are the same ones that make, for example, benzene water soluble. Benzene is something that we breathe in through air pollution, through wildfires, smoking cigarettes, right? And there's now at least 3 different human studies showing that people that consume sulforaphane in the form of its precursor, glucoraphanin, and then, are exposed to benzene, they excrete 60% more benzene after 24 hours. And that's because you're basically activating that pathway, NRF2 pathway, through the sulforaphane. Sulforaphane's the biggest natural product activator, the biggest dietary activator of that system, that detox system, is sulforaphane. So I take sulforaphane every day. I take a product called Avmacol, which is the reason I do Avmacol is because it's been shown in 12 different clinical studies to be effective, and they have a really good product. And I'm not associated with them or affiliated with them. I just happen to like stuff that's evidence based. So I do that every day, and that is essentially to get rid of these plastic-associated chemicals like BPA and the phthalates. Now, you mentioned bile acids. That's interesting because that would kind of bring us into the forever chemical category. So forever chemicals, those are, these are the chemicals. They're called forever chemicals because unlike BPA, which has a half-life in our body of a couple of hours, we're just constantly exposed to it, constantly. So that half-life is like 2.5 hours or something like that. And then if you take the sulforaphane, you're gonna basically cut that in half. So you're gonna basically get rid of it faster. The forever chemicals stay in our body for years, up to like 5 years. And it's really, they stick around, and they are also very damaging, right? So the way that those chemicals are excreted are through bile acids. And actually there's some animal evidence out there showing that the beta glucans in like oats or mushrooms can excrete the forever chemical clearance through bile acids.
Interesting.
So that's kind of interesting that you were kind of mentioning that pathway as well. But it's important to keep in mind, there's all these plastic compounds and chemicals and microplastics that we're exposed to. And yes, you should try to, reduce your exposure to them by getting a reverse osmosis water filter to refilter, because they're in our water, by try not to eat packaged foods. They're all in our, anything with packaged foods, they shed into our food. We're eating them. There's lots of avoid putting hot beverages into plastic. So like to-go beverage cups are lined with plastic. You're getting, orders of magnitude more microplastics. You're drinking plastic coffee is what you're doing when you go to Starbucks and get those disposable cups because they're lined with plastic. So that's a do what you can to reduce your exposure, but you're not going to completely reduce it. I mean, it's just literally everywhere in all of our food. It's in our meat. All meat is being packaged in plastic. Even if you're a hunter, you're gonna put your stuff in the freezer. What are you gonna do? You're gonna vacuum seal it in plastic. It's everywhere. So you want to try to do what you can to mitigate your exposure to it, but you also want to try to detox from it. And I think the best ways to do that, like I said, fiber for the microplastics, both soluble and insoluble fiber, sulforaphane. So whether it's broccoli sprouts or you take a supplement like I do to get rid of the plastic chemicals like BPA, BPS, and then making sure that you're getting those, again, soluble fiber, fermentable fiber from beta glucans like the mushrooms and the oats to help with the forever chemicals.
Does it matter if mushrooms, they don't have to be raw or anything, right? You could saute them or?
You can saute them, yeah.
With the broccoli, there's a way to get more sulforaphane out of it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So broccoli sprouts have about 100 times more of the precursor to sulforaphane, glucoraphanin, than mature broccoli. And I'm just calling it sulforaphane because it's easier for people to grasp that concept. But mature broccoli, if you want to get more of that, glucoraphanin out of it, you can, and conversion into sulforaphane, what you do is you add mustard seed powder to it, because mustard seed powder has an enzyme, myrosinase, that converts the glucoraphanin into sulforaphane. And so you're going to get up to 4-fold more. There was a human study showing that people that added mustard seed powder to their broccoli increased the bioavailability by 4-fold. So that's a trick that I need to remember to add back, because I used to do it religiously. Now I supplement with this. So I figure I get it all from my supplement, but that's a little hack to do as well.
I'm a mustard nerd too. I've done some videos on myrosinase, and mustard has an interesting impact on a TRPV1 receptor and some other things. Actually has a pretty, it's temporary, but it's not insignificant effect on appetite suppression. So it's kind of funny because I used to always if I was cutting and I was trying to drop fat, I would do sliced chicken, and I was just mustard was always the thing. And that was interesting because it actually seems to have a little bit of an appetite suppressant effect. A little bit of, again, one of those mechanistic nerdy things that I get out on that might not be, the most important thing in the world, but I'm a big fan of mustard for a lot of different reasons anyway. Another fun fact about mustard is, how you might know this, but it was kind of old school to have like mustard on the sidelines for like football players, like in case there were cramps, like spicy mustard. Have you seen this?
No.
So again, this is another thing I learned from the Army Special Forces guys. Is like a big thing is they would do like make little concoctions of like hot sauce and mustard. And if there was like ever like a cramp, it's a nervous system. I don't know the full mechanism, but essentially it's a nervous system thing that kind of, if you're in a cramp, by having something spicy or like really tangy, the nervous system kind of shuts off the cramp temporarily. So when you have something that has a certain spice to it. So if you talk to like football coaches from like the 60s, that used to be a thing. They would always have mustard because it would work. And like now we're starting to kind of understand, okay, this might be the mechanism here, but it actually works. So although I can't tell you, like, who knows, I could be placeboing myself, but I mean, I kid you not, like when I was doing super low carb stuff all the time, I was really prone to cramps, and I would go on these like longer, endurance events and like mountaineering things. And, taurine would work to a certain degree if I preloaded it. But then I was like, okay, I'll try the mustard thing. Okay, you got me. I'll try it. Holy crap, it actually works. Like you start to feel the cramp coming on, you start to lock up. It's like something about having something spicy. I don't know if it's just that the all or nothing sort of principle where the brain has to kind of say, oh, like something spicy, turn off the cramp, but it legit works.
I love spicy anyway, so that's great to know.
Yeah, no, it's wild. So, Rhonda, this was awesome. Where can everyone find you?
So I have a podcast. They can find me on YouTube. Found My Fitness is the podcast YouTube channel. It's also on, Apple Podcasts and Spotify as well. I have a website, foundmyfitness.com. We send out a free newsletter every week. Really, really good, covering like stuff that we talked about today. I mean, all like the interesting health related, actionable information that's important for long-term health and also just for mental health and feeling better. So those would be where you can find me. And we have a bunch of free guides out there as well. People can look up a how to train guide, how to train according to the experts that all the experts I've had on my podcast. And so you can find that at howtotrainguide.com.
Perfect. Right on, Rhonda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. It's been really cool.